Imagine Constantinople in 1513. The city that had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire for more than 1,000 years has been Ottoman for 60 years now, taken by Mehmed II in 1453 and transformed into the center of one of the most powerful empires on earth. The Hagia Sophia, which for nearly 1,000 years was the greatest church in Christendom, has been a mosque for 6 decades. The Topkapi Palace, built on the promontory overlooking the confluence of the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, is the seat of an empire that stretches from Hungary to Persia, from the Crimea to Egypt. In a room in the palace, or in a study in the city, or on the deck of a ship, the specific location is not recorded, a man is drawing a map. His name is Piri Reis. He is a naval officer in the Ottoman fleet, a nephew of the celebrated privateer Kemal Reis, and he is already known among his contemporaries as an exceptional navigator and cartographer. He has sailed the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. He has fought naval battles. He has accumulated, over the course of a professional life at sea, an extraordinary collection of charts and navigational documents from Turkish, Arab, Portuguese and Spanish sources, including, he will later claim, in the marginal notes of the map he is making, charts that were captured from Christopher Columbus. The map he is drawing in 1513 is a map of the Atlantic Ocean and the lands on both sides of it. He is working on gazelle skin, a single piece of vellum approximately 90 centimetres by 60 centimetres. His tools are a pen and ink, compasses, and the accumulated geographical knowledge of an age of exploration that is transforming the European and Ottoman understanding of the world's geography. He is drawing the coastlines of Europe, Africa, and the newly discovered Americas. He is drawing the Atlantic islands. He is drawing, in the southern portion of his map, a landmass that extends along the bottom of the known world. That southern landmass is the object that has made the Piri Reis map one of the most discussed cartographic documents in history. Because some researchers have argued that the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map is not a speculative extension of South America, not a mythological southern continent, not a cartographic convention. They argue that it is Antarctica. And they argue that it shows Antarctica's coastline not as it looks today, buried under kilometres of ice, but as it looked when it was ice-free. Before the ice came, before human memory, before, according to the geological record, any human being was anywhere near it. Let me stay a moment with Piri Reis himself, because he deserves more than a passing introduction. Piri Reis, his full name was Muhyiddin Piri, and Reis was an Ottoman naval title roughly equivalent to Admiral, was born around 1470 in Gelibolu on the Dardanelles. He went to sea young, under his uncle Kemal Reis, one of the most celebrated privateers of the 15th century. His career was a life of voyages, battles, and charts. He participated in major naval engagements in the Indian Ocean, commanded fleets in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and was eventually appointed Admiral of the Egyptian fleet. He was executed in 1553 at approximately 80 years old after a disastrous military failure against the Portuguese. Between the voyages and the battles, Piri Reis collected charts, Turkish pilots' guides, Arab navigational tables, Portuguese charts captured in battle, and Spanish charts that made their way into Ottoman hands through various channels. He was, by the standards of his time, one of the best informed cartographers in the world. The 1513 map is the surviving fragment of a larger work. What remains today covers the Atlantic and the lands on both sides of it, from the British Isles south to the disputed landmass at the bottom of the map. My name is Arthur, and tonight we are going to examine one of the most persistent and most discussed anomalies in the history of ancient cartography. Before we go further, hello to whoever is listening right now. I don't know what time it is where you are. I don't know whether you've been here from the beginning of this series or whether tonight is your first time. Either way, welcome. If you want more videos like this, please click subscribe to show your support. A great deal of effort goes into making these videos, and simply subscribing genuinely makes a difference in keeping this channel going. And leave a comment if you feel moved to. Tell me where you are and what time it is. Now, let me tell you what is claimed about this map, and then let me tell you what the evidence actually shows. The Piri Reis map was drawn in 1513 and presented to the Ottoman Sultan Selim I in 1517. It was lost for centuries in the archives of the Topkapi Palace and rediscovered in 1929 during a survey of the palace collection. What the scholars who examined it found was a map of the Atlantic world that was, for its date, remarkably accurate in many respects. The coastlines of Europe and Africa and much of South America were rendered with a precision that reflected the best navigational knowledge of the early 16th century. But it was the southern portion of the map that attracted the most intense attention. Below the South American coastline, the map shows a continuous landmass extending east and west along the bottom of the map. This landmass is labelled with various names and accompanied by marginal notes describing its features. It is connected in the upper portions to what appears to be the South American coastline, but it extends much further east and curves around the bottom of the mapped area in a way that looks, to some observers, like the coastline of a continent. The claim that this landmass represents Antarctica was developed most fully by the American historian Charles Hapgood in his 1966 book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. Hapgood argued that the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map corresponded, in its general outline, to the coastline of the Antarctic continent, specifically to the coastline of Queen Maud Land, the portion of Antarctica that lies south of the Atlantic Ocean. He further argued that this coastline matched the subglacial topography of Antarctica, the shape of the land beneath the ice, as revealed by 20th century seismic surveys, better than it matched the surface topography as obscured by the ice sheet. In other words, he was claiming that the map showed Antarctica as it had looked before it was covered by its current ice sheet, before approximately 4000 BCE, the last time Antarctica's coastline was significantly ice-free. If Hapgood were right, the implications would be extraordinary. Someone, at some point before 4000 BCE, would have had to have surveyed the coastline of Antarctica, possessed the cartographic skill to render it accurately, and preserved that information in a form that eventually reached Piri Reis in 1513. It would require the existence of a maritime civilization of extraordinary capability, thousands of years before any known civilization possessed either the seafaring technology to reach Antarctica or the cartographic methods to survey its coastline. That is the claim. And it is an extraordinary, like the other claims we have been examining in this series, the Great Sphinx water erosion, the Gunung Padang buried structure. The Piri Reis Antarctica claim sits at the intersection of genuine evidence and extraordinary interpretation. The map is real. The question is what it shows. Tonight, we are going to find out. But before we examine the evidence in detail, let me place the Piri Reis map in the broader context of early 16th century cartography. Because understanding what mapmakers of this period were doing, what they knew and what they didn't know, and how they handled geographical uncertainty is essential for understanding what the map does and does not show. The early 16th century was the most exciting period in the history of European cartography. Columbus had reached the Americas in 1492. Vasco da Gama had rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1497 and reached India in 1498. Magellan's circumnavigation would be completed in 1522, less than a decade after the Piri Reis map was drawn. The world was being remapped in real time, with new geographical information arriving in Lisbon and Seville and Constantinople from explorers whose reports were sometimes contradictory, always incomplete, and occasionally fabricated. In this context, European and Ottoman cartographers faced a specific challenge: how to represent the parts of the world that had been explored while acknowledging the parts that had not yet been reached. The conventional solution was the speculative extension, drawing coastlines and landmasses in the unknown regions based on theoretical reasoning, analogy with known regions, and the accumulated mythological and philosophical tradition of what the unexplored world might contain. The southern continent was one of the most persistent of these speculative extensions. From the ancient Greeks onward, geographers had argued that there must be a large landmass in the southern hemisphere to counterbalance the land in the northern, a Terra Australis incognita, an unknown southern land that maintained the symmetry of the globe. This theoretical southern continent appeared on maps for centuries before Antarctica was actually discovered, in various shapes and at various positions. Understanding this tradition is the essential context for evaluating the Piri Reis map's southern landmass. Is it Antarctica? Or is it the latest version of a theoretical convention that had been on maps for centuries? That is the question, and the answer matters. Let me describe the map. The Piri Reis map of 1513 is a single sheet of gazelle skin vellum, approximately 90 centimetres wide and 60 centimetres tall. The vellum is buff-coloured, darkened with age, its surface covered with ink lines and painted colours that have faded but not disappeared across 5 centuries. It is one of the most carefully examined documents in the history of cartography. Reproduced, measured, digitized, and argued over by historians, geographers, and alternative history researchers for nearly 100 years since its rediscovery in 1929. The rediscovery itself has a specific quality of the accidentally found. In October 1929, a German theologian named Gustav Adolf Deissmann was conducting a survey of the Topkapi Palace Library as part of a broader project to catalogue the palace's collections. Among the maps and charts in the library, he found a parchment fragment, folded and filed away, apparently unexamined for an unknown number of centuries, that turned out to be one of the most significant cartographic documents of the 16th century. Deissmann's discovery was announced to the world and attracted immediate scholarly attention. The provenance before the library is uncertain. The map was presented to the Ottoman Sultan Selim I in 1517, 4 years after it was drawn. Whether it remained in the palace library continuously from 1517 to 1929, or whether it circulated elsewhere during that period, is not documented. What is certain is that it was in the Topkapi collection when Deissmann found it, and it has remained there since. Now let me describe what the map actually shows, working from north to south and east to west. The upper portion of the map shows the coasts of Europe and North Africa with considerable accuracy for its period. The Iberian Peninsula, the British Isles, the coastlines of France and Italy, and the Levant, these are recognizably themselves, if somewhat distorted by the cartographic conventions of the early 16th century. The Mediterranean is shown in reasonable proportion. The Atlantic Islands, the Azores, the Canaries, the Cape Verde Islands are marked and correctly positioned relative to the coasts. The middle portion of the map shows the Atlantic Ocean and, on its western side, the newly discovered coastlines of the Americas. The Caribbean islands are shown with some accuracy. The coast of Central America and the northern coast of South America are rendered in a form consistent with the exploration that had been conducted by the time of the map's drawing. Columbian and post-Columbian in origin, reflecting the charts that Piri Reis claims to have obtained from Spanish sources. The South American coastline extends south, and then, in the lower portion of the map, does something unusual. Rather than ending, rather than trailing off into the blank vellum that cartographers of the period typically use to indicate unknown territory, it continues eastward and then curves, becoming a landmass that extends across the entire bottom of the surviving map. This southern landmass is the focus of the debate. It is depicted in considerable detail. Rivers are shown, bays and promontories are indicated, and the marginal notes in Ottoman Turkish provide descriptions of the land and its features. The landmass is coloured and decorated. It was clearly not an afterthought or a casual extension. It was drawn with deliberate attention. The marginal notes, the explanatory texts that Piri Reis inscribed around the edges of the map, are one of the most valuable sources of information about what he was doing and what he thought he was drawing. These notes have been translated and studied by Ottoman scholars and historians of cartography, and they reveal several important things. First, the notes describe the sources Piri Reis used for the map. He lists approximately 20 sources in total, including Arab and Portuguese charts, a map of India, 8 Ptolemaic maps, and, most famously, charts that he says were obtained from a Spanish prisoner who had sailed with Christopher Columbus on one or more of his voyages to the New World. Some scholars have interpreted this source as Columbus's own charts. Others are more cautious, noting that the marginal note does not specifically claim this. This source list is important for understanding the map. Piri Reis was not drawing from a single coherent source. He was synthesizing a large number of different charts of varying age, scale, and accuracy, and combining them into a single representation. The process of combining multiple charts with different projection systems, different scales, and different levels of accuracy is inherently productive of distortions and inconsistencies. A cartographer attempting to stitch together charts from a dozen different sources will produce a map in which some regions are accurately rendered and others are significantly distorted. Not because the cartographer was incompetent, but because the underlying sources disagreed with each other, and the task of reconciling them was fundamentally difficult. This context is essential for evaluating the southern landmass. If the southern portion of the map was drawn from different and possibly older sources than the portions depicting Europe, Africa, and the Atlantic Islands, and the notes suggest that different sections of the map came from different sources, then the southern landmass may reflect geographical knowledge and cartographic conventions from a different tradition than the rest of the map. Second, the marginal notes describe the southern landmass in terms that are consistent with South America. They describe hot climates, exotic animals, including large serpents and parrots. Some of the descriptions are fanciful in the manner of Renaissance geographical writing about unknown territories, but none of the descriptions specifically says that the landmass is cold, covered in ice, or otherwise characteristic of Antarctica. This is a significant detail. If Piri Reis believed he was drawing Antarctica, or if his sources had drawn Antarctica, you might expect some indication of the continent's cold, icy character in the marginal notes. Instead, the notes describe a warm, tropical-seeming land, which is more consistent with South America or the mythological Terra Australis than with a continent that sits at 90 degrees south. Third, the notes make no claim to secret or ancient knowledge. Piri Reis describes his sources in matter-of-fact terms. These are charts he obtained from various navigators and geographers, combined and rendered into a single map. There is no suggestion that any of the sources was extraordinarily ancient, that any contained knowledge beyond what 16th century exploration had produced, or that the map was doing anything more remarkable than synthesizing the best available geographical information of the period. This too is significant. The sources Piri Reis describes are entirely consistent with the geographical knowledge available in the early 16th century. If the map was drawing on sources that predated Columbus, on charts that somehow preserved ancient knowledge of Antarctica's coastline, you would expect some indication of this in the notes. There is none. Let me also describe the physical dimensions and the decorative elements of the map, because they provide context for understanding the map's purpose and status. The map is richly decorated in the tradition of Portolan charts, the navigational charts of the medieval and early modern Mediterranean that were characterized by their network of rhumb lines radiating from compass roses, their accurate coastal outlines, and their decorative illustrations of ships, sea monsters, and the peoples of distant lands. The Piri Reis map continues this tradition. The land masses are decorated with illustrations of animals, trees, and human figures. The Atlantic is populated with drawings of ships, including a Spanish carrack of the type that would have been familiar from contemporary illustrations. The compass roses, the decorated points from which the rhumb lines radiate, are placed at regular intervals across the map. 16 compass roses are visible on the surviving fragment, which is consistent with the standard practice of Portolan chart construction. The rhumb lines that radiate from these roses form a network across the map that was used by navigators to determine compass bearings between ports. The Portolan chart tradition is important for understanding the map's southern landmass, because Portolan charts had specific conventions for handling unknown regions that are relevant to the debate. When a Portolan chart maker reached the limit of known geography, they did not necessarily leave the vellum blank. They sometimes extended coastlines speculatively in the direction that exploration suggested, or added hypothetical landmasses based on theoretical reasoning. The southern portion of the Piri Reis map may reflect this convention rather than actual survey data. Now let me address a specific feature of the map that is central to the Antarctica debate: the apparent continuity between the South American coastline and the southern landmass. On the surviving fragment, the South American coast runs south and then connects without a clear break to the eastern end of the southern landmass. Critics of the Antarctica hypothesis use this connection as evidence that the southern landmass is an extension of South America rather than a separate continent. If the draftsman had intended to show Antarctica as a distinct continent, separated from South America by the Drake Passage, you would expect the two to be shown as separate land masses, as they appear on accurate modern maps. Proponents of the Antarctica hypothesis respond that the absence of the Drake Passage on the Piri Reis map is itself evidence of the map's ancient origin, that an ancient source showing the Antarctic coastline was drawn before the Drake Passage was known, or before the source cartographer had information about the waters between South America and Antarctica. This response is an example of the specific logical structure that makes the Piri Reis debate so difficult to resolve. Any feature of the map that appears to confirm the hypothesis is taken as evidence for it. Any feature that seems to contradict it is reinterpreted as additional evidence of the ancient source's limitations. The hypothesis is constructed to be consistent with any evidence, which means it is not really testable. We will explore this logical structure more fully in the parts of tonight's journey that deal specifically with the counter-arguments. For now, let the map rest in the mind as a physical object, a piece of gazelle skin covered in careful ink lines, 5 centuries old, lying in a drawer in the Topkapi Palace until a German theologian happened to open it in 1929. Real, specific, valuable, and about to be the subject of one of the most persistent controversies in the history of ancient cartography. Let me also spend more time with the Portolan chart tradition itself, because I think it is underexplained in most popular accounts of the Piri Reis map, and understanding it properly changes how you read the southern landmass. Portolan charts, from the Italian Portolano, meaning a book of sailing directions, were the working charts of medieval and early modern Mediterranean navigators. They first appeared in the late 13th century and were produced continuously by chart makers in Genoa, Venice, Majorca, and other Mediterranean centres through the 15th and 16th centuries. They were practical instruments designed to be used at sea, and they were extraordinarily accurate for their purpose. They rendered the coastlines of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea with a precision that was not significantly improved until the era of scientific surveying in the 18th century. The specific accuracy of Portolan charts for the Mediterranean is one of the most discussed topics in the history of cartography. The charts were accurate enough that modern researchers using GPS have confirmed that the positions of specific ports and headlands on surviving Portolan charts are correct to within a few kilometres. How the medieval chart makers achieved this accuracy, without the mathematical framework of latitude and longitude that we now take for granted, without the precise instruments of modern surveying, is a question that historians of cartography have not fully resolved. The working answer is that Portolan charts were compiled from a very large number of individual observations made by mariners over many decades and centuries. Compass bearings between known ports, estimates of distance from the time required to sail between them, and the accumulated experience of generations of navigators who had sailed the same waters. This accumulated observational data was combined by chart makers into a consistent representation that was more accurate than any single navigator's knowledge because it incorporated the knowledge of many. The important point for the Piri Reis debate is this. The specific accuracy of Portolan charts applied to the Mediterranean because the Mediterranean had been intensively navigated for centuries. The accuracy did not automatically extend to waters that had been navigated for a much shorter time. When Portolan chart makers extended their tradition to the Atlantic, to the African coast, to the newly discovered Americas, to the waters south of the Cape of Good Hope, they were working with much less accumulated navigational data. Their charts of the Atlantic coasts were less accurate than their charts of the Mediterranean because there was less accumulated observational data to draw on. And for the regions beyond the frontier of exploration, the unknown south, the hypothetical Terra Australis, they had no observational data at all. In the absence of observational data, Portolan chart makers fell back on the theoretical tradition of the southern continent and on the specific conventions of their craft. They drew coastlines where they believed coastlines should be, extended known coasts in the directions that exploration seemed to suggest, and filled in the blank vellum with geographical conventions that their audience would recognize as signifying the unknown rather than the known. The southern landmass on the Piri Reis map should be read in this context. It is not necessarily a record of actual observation. It may be, it probably is, a combination of the theoretical Terra Australis tradition, the specific geographical knowledge available to a 16th century Ottoman cartographer, the speculative extensions of the South American coastline that were conventional in charts of the period, and possibly some actual observational data from the limited exploration of the South Atlantic that had been conducted by the time the map was drawn. The specific mixture of these elements in the Piri Reis map's southern landmass is the question that the scholarly debate has been trying to resolve for nearly a century. And the resolution, as we will see in the parts of tonight's journey that examine the Antarctica hypothesis and the counter-arguments, is clearer than the popular accounts suggest. The map is remarkable without being a record of ancient Antarctic surveys. It is the work of one of the most skilled cartographers of a remarkable age of exploration, and it is worth understanding as such. Let me tell you about Charles Hapgood. Charles Hapgood was an American academic, a professor of the history of science and anthropology at Keene State College in New Hampshire, where he taught from the 1940s until his retirement. He was not a professional cartographer, not a geologist, not a specialist in Renaissance maps or Ottoman history. He was a generalist intellectual of a kind that was more common in mid-20th century American academia than it is today. Someone who ranged freely across disciplines, who followed questions wherever they led regardless of departmental boundaries, and who was willing to take positions that most of his colleagues found implausible. Hapgood developed the Antarctica hypothesis in stages across the 1950s and 1960s. His 1958 book, Earth's Shifting Crust, proposed a theory of rapid geographic pole shifts. The idea that the Earth's outer crust periodically slips over the interior, moving the positions of the poles relative to the continents and causing massive, rapid climate changes. This theory was controversial and is not supported by the geological evidence. The standard model of plate tectonics, which describes the slow movement of continental plates over hundreds of millions of years, provides a much better account of the geological record than Hapgood's pole shift hypothesis. What is remarkable about Earth's shifting crust is not its scientific validity, but the foreword that Hapgood obtained for it, a letter of endorsement from Albert Einstein, written shortly before Einstein's death in 1955. Einstein expressed interest in Hapgood's ideas and encouraged him to develop and publish them, while acknowledging that he did not have the geological expertise to assess their scientific merits. The Einstein letter has been used ever since by proponents of Hapgood's ideas as evidence of their credibility, though Einstein's expressed interest in an unconventional idea is not the same as scientific endorsement of its correctness. Hapgood's 1966 book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, applied his pole shift ideas to the problem of ancient maps. His central argument was that a number of medieval and Renaissance maps, including the Piri Reis map, the Orontius Phineus map of 1531 and several others, showed geographical features that could not have been known to the medieval or Renaissance cartographers who drew them, and that therefore represented copies of much older source maps produced by an ancient civilization with advanced cartographic capabilities. The Piri Reis map was the centerpiece of the argument. Hapgood argued that the southern landmass on the map corresponded in its outline and its internal geography to the coastline of Antarctica, specifically to the subglacial topography of Antarctica, the shape of the land beneath the ice, as revealed by the seismic surveys conducted as part of the International Geophysical Year in 1957 to 1958. The timing of the claim was not accidental. Hapgood was writing in the immediate aftermath of the first systematic survey of Antarctica's subglacial topography, and he was one of the first people to make the comparison between the Piri Reis southern landmass and the newly revealed Antarctic coastline. The specific technical argument Hapgood made involved the concept of map projection. A map projection is the mathematical system used to represent the curved surface of the Earth on a flat sheet of paper. Different projections preserve different properties. Some preserve angles, some preserve areas, some preserve distances, and all projections distort some aspect of the Earth's geometry. The choice of projection affects how the mapped features are positioned relative to each other, and a map drawn using one projection will look different from the same geographical area drawn using a different projection. Hapgood argued that the Piri Reis map was drawn using a specific projection centered on a specific point, a point that he identified as Syene in Egypt, the ancient city of Aswan. He then reprojected the southern landmass of the Piri Reis map from this center point to a standard modern projection and argued that the resulting coastline matched the subglacial topography of Antarctica. This is the core of the technical claim. It is also the core of the technical controversy. To evaluate whether Hapgood was right, you need to assess three things: whether his identification of the map's projection center was correct, whether his reprojection methodology was sound, and whether the resulting match with Antarctic topography was as good as he claimed. We will assess all three of these in detail when we come to the counter-arguments. But let me first describe Hapgood's argument in full, because it is important to understand what he was claiming before we examine whether the claim is correct. Hapgood's argument proceeded in several steps. First, he identified what he called the error analysis of the Piri Reis map. The systematic patterns in the map's inaccuracies that revealed, he argued, the projection system used by the ancient source cartographers. He claimed that the errors in the map were not random, but followed a pattern consistent with a specific projection centered on a specific point, and that by correcting for these errors you could recover the original, accurate ancient map. Second, having reprojected the southern landmass, he compared it to the subglacial topography of Antarctica. He found what he claimed were striking correspondences: bays, peninsulas, mountains, and river systems on the Piri Reis southern landmass that matched features visible in the seismic survey data of Antarctica's ice-covered coastline. Third, he argued that the quality of the match was too good to be a coincidence, that the probability of achieving this level of correspondence by chance, without the ancient source cartographers having actually surveyed the Antarctic coastline, was vanishingly small. Fourth, he connected this argument to his pole shift theory. If Antarctica's coastline was ice-free in the period when the ancient cartographers surveyed it, and the geological evidence suggests that Antarctica has been ice-covered for approximately 15 million years, with some periods of reduced ice cover in the more recent past. Then the pole shift theory was needed to explain how Antarctica could have been warm enough to survey at the time the map was drawn. The full argument is therefore not just about the Piri Reis map. It is about the entire framework of Hapgood's alternative prehistory, an ancient civilization with advanced technology, a major pole shift that ended that civilization, and the survival of its cartographic knowledge in fragmentary form in the maps of the medieval and Renaissance world. This is a much bigger claim than simply the Piri Reis map shows Antarctica. It is a claim about an entirely different picture of human prehistory, one in which the conventional timeline is wrong by thousands of years, and the capabilities of ancient peoples are radically different from what the archaeological record shows. The popularity of Hapgood's work, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, has never gone out of print and continues to sell widely, reflects the specific appeal of this alternative prehistory narrative. It is not just an interesting anomaly in the history of cartography, it is the key to unlocking a hidden history of the world. This appeal is both the strength and the weakness of Hapgood's argument. The strength is that it engages people, draws attention to the genuine mysteries of ancient cartography, and motivates careful examination of maps that mainstream historians had largely ignored. The weakness is that the narrative appeal can override the evidential standards that should govern the evaluation of extraordinary claims. Hapgood was a careful researcher in many respects. He documented his sources. He applied specific technical methods to the maps. He engaged with the cartographic literature of his time. His work is not simply fantasy. It is a genuine attempt to apply scholarly methods to an extraordinary hypothesis. But the hypothesis is wrong, not because it is inherently implausible or because ancient maps are not worth studying carefully, or because the history of cartography does not contain genuine mysteries, but because the specific technical arguments Hapgood made, the projection analysis, the error correction, the match with Antarctic topography, do not hold up under scrutiny. Let me explain why. The first problem is the projection center. Hapgood's entire reprojection methodology depends on his identification of Syene, Egypt, as the center point of the ancient projection. If this identification is wrong, if the map was not drawn using a projection centered on Syene, then the entire reprojection exercise is meaningless, because you cannot recover a projection from a different center point by treating it as if it were drawn from the point you have assumed. Hapgood's identification of Siena as the projection center was not the result of independent mathematical analysis of the map's geometry. It was partly circular. He chose Siena partly because using it as a projection center produced a southern landmass that looked more like Antarctica than other candidate center points. This is not a valid cartometric method. A valid method would identify the projection center independently of the outcome, and then test whether the outcome matches the hypothesis. The second problem is the quality of the match itself. Hapgood's claims about the correspondence between the Piri Reis southern landmass and the Antarctic coastline were based on visual comparison of hand-traced outlines on paper. This is an inherently imprecise method that is vulnerable to the tendency of the human visual system to find patterns in noisy data, particularly when the observer is strongly motivated to find a pattern. When later researchers applied more rigorous quantitative methods to the comparison, using computer-based cartometric analysis to objectively measure the degree of correspondence between the Piri Reis southern landmass and the Antarctic coastline, they found that the match was not as good as Hapgood claimed. The coastline of the Piri Reis southern landmass corresponded to the Antarctic coastline at a level not significantly better than chance. These are the technical grounds on which the Antarctica hypothesis fails. We will develop these arguments more fully in Part 6, when we examine the specific cartographic analysis in detail. For now, let the image of Hapgood sit in the mind. A New Hampshire academic, working in the late 1950s and early 1960s, looking at a reproduction of the Piri Reis map and seeing in its southern landmass the outline of a continent that no one was supposed to have known about. He may have been wrong about what he was seeing, but the question he was asking, where did this map come from and what do its sources tell us about the limits of ancient geographical knowledge, is a genuine question, and it deserves a genuine answer. Let me spend more time with the specific intellectual context in which Hapgood was working, because the 1960s were a particular moment in the history of ideas about ancient history, and Hapgood's work needs to be understood within that context. The 1950s and 1960s were a period of considerable excitement about the possibility of ancient advanced civilizations. The decipherment of Linear B in 1952 revealed that the Mycenaean Greeks had a sophisticated writing system centuries before the classical Greeks. The discovery and initial excavation of sites like Çatalhöyük in Turkey, a Neolithic city of remarkable complexity dating to approximately 7000 BCE, was challenging the conventional understanding of prehistoric human capability. The success of Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki voyage in 1947, demonstrating that prehistoric peoples could have made transoceanic voyages on simple rafts, had opened the imagination to the possibility of ancient long-distance connections that conventional archaeology had dismissed. In this context, Hapgood's argument that ancient maps contained knowledge that predated the conventional timeline of exploration was not as implausible as it might seem in retrospect. The question of what ancient peoples knew and what they were capable of was genuinely open in the 1960s in a way that it had not been before, and the discovery of new evidence was regularly challenging comfortable assumptions. Hapgood was also writing before the plate tectonics revolution had fully settled into the geological consensus. The theory of continental drift, that the continents move over geological time, was still being debated in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and the specific mechanisms of how the Earth's surface changes were not as well understood as they are today. In this context, Hapgood's pole shift theory, while unconventional, was not obviously wrong in the way that it appears in retrospect from the perspective of modern plate tectonic theory. Einstein's letter deserves some careful treatment. The letter, written in 1955, expresses genuine interest in Hapgood's ideas and encourages him to develop them. Einstein wrote that the shifting of the Earth's crust relative to its interior was not in itself impossible, and that Hapgood's theory deserved to be taken seriously and examined rigorously. What the letter does not do is endorse the specific conclusions of Hapgood's work, validate his interpretation of ancient maps, or constitute a scientific assessment of the geological evidence. Einstein was a physicist, not a geologist or a cartographer. His expressed interest in an unconventional theory reflects his genuine intellectual openness and his willingness to engage with ideas outside his primary field of expertise. It does not make those ideas correct. The use of the Einstein letter in popular accounts of Hapgood's work, where it is often cited as evidence that even Einstein thought the ancient Antarctic maps were real, is a misrepresentation of what the letter actually says and what Einstein's endorsement means. It is the kind of argument from authority that takes the prestige of a famous name and attaches it to conclusions that the famous person never actually reached. This is worth noting because it illustrates a broader pattern in the popular reception of fringe scholarship. The tendency to use the prestige of mainstream figures to lend credibility to claims that those figures did not actually endorse. Einstein was interested in Hapgood's geology. He was not writing about maps of Antarctica. Let me also address the question of why the Hapgood hypothesis has retained its popular appeal for more than half a century after it was published, despite the scholarly consensus against it. The appeal is real, and it is not simply the product of gullibility. It reflects a genuine and legitimate frustration with the way that mainstream archaeology and history have sometimes treated anomalous evidence, dismissing it too quickly, closing off questions that deserve more careful consideration, protecting the consensus with more rigor than the consensus sometimes deserves. There is also a specific aesthetic appeal to the idea that the history of the world is longer and stranger than the textbooks say. That somewhere in the deep past there were people who knew things we do not credit them with knowing, who sailed seas we assume were uncharted, who mapped continents we assume were undiscovered. This appeal is connected to the general human fascination with lost worlds and hidden knowledge that we have been exploring throughout this series. The lost civilization that produced the ancient Antarctic maps is a compelling image. It is the image of people looking at a cold and distant continent, making careful measurements, recording what they saw with the cartographic precision of a tradition that has since been lost. It is, in its own way, as compelling as the cave paintings of Lascaux, evidence of ancient minds doing something we would recognize as the work of intelligence and care. The problem is that the image is not supported by the evidence. The evidence shows something less dramatic, but no less interesting. A 16th century Ottoman admiral synthesizing the best geographical knowledge of his age from a wide range of sources, producing a map that was remarkable for its time, and that reflects the specific character of geographical knowledge at the dawn of the age of global exploration. That story is genuinely interesting. It does not need to be more than it is. Let me tell you about the southern continent that existed on maps before Antarctica was discovered. This is the essential counter-argument to the Piri Reis Antarctica hypothesis, and it is a counter-argument that is both specific and decisive. To understand why the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map does not prove an ancient knowledge of Antarctica, you need to understand the tradition of the Terra Australis incognita, the unknown southern land, that had been appearing on European maps for well over a century before Piri Reis drew his map in 1513. The Terra Australis tradition begins with the ancient Greeks. The Pythagorean and then Aristotelian tradition of Greek philosophy held that the Earth was a sphere, and that a sphere should have its mass distributed symmetrically. The northern hemisphere, from the perspective of Mediterranean philosophers, was known to contain large masses of land: Europe, Africa, and Asia. The southern hemisphere, by analogy, should also contain large land masses. Otherwise, the sphere would be unbalanced. This symmetry argument was not purely aesthetic. It was connected to a specific cosmological framework in which the proper arrangement of the elements required a balance of land and water across the globe. The philosopher Crates of Malus, working in the 2nd century BCE, produced a globe that showed 4 inhabited regions separated by 2 great oceans: the known northern world, a corresponding southern world, and 2 more worlds in the eastern and western hemispheres. Each inhabited region was separated from the others by uncrossable seas, or by zones too hot or too cold for human life. The geography of Ptolemy, the 2nd century CE Greek geographer whose work dominated European geographical thinking through the Renaissance, included a southern continent in the Indian Ocean region. On Ptolemaic maps, Africa connects to a great southern landmass that closes off the Indian Ocean and prevents it from being a true ocean. This Ptolemaic southern landmass was reproduced on virtually every map based on Ptolemy's geography through the 15th century. When European cartographers began updating and revising the Ptolemaic picture in the light of new exploration, when Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1497 and demonstrated that the Indian Ocean was open to the south, they did not simply abandon the idea of a southern continent. They moved it further south. The Terra Australis incognita became a hypothetical landmass at high southern latitudes, present on maps as a theoretical necessity even in the absence of actual exploratory data. The maps produced by European cartographers in the decades before and after the Piri Reis map are full of this speculative southern land. The Waldseemüller map of 1507, the famous map that first used the name America, shows a large southern continent at the bottom of the mapped world. The Schoner globe of 1515, made 2 years after the Piri Reis map, shows a massive Terra Australis. The Orontius Phineus map of 1531, which Hapgood also claimed showed Antarctica, shows a huge southern continent with an interior detail suggesting rivers and bays. These maps were not drawing on secret ancient knowledge. They were drawing on the Ptolemaic tradition, on theoretical symmetry arguments, and on the specific conventions of Renaissance cartography for depicting unknown regions. The southern continent on the Piri Reis map is part of this tradition. It is what 16th century cartographers put at the bottom of their maps when they ran out of explored territory. This context is devastating for the Antarctica hypothesis because it means the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map does not require any special explanation. It does not require an ancient Antarctic survey. It does not require a lost civilization with advanced cartographic capability. It requires only that Piri Reis was a cartographer working in the standard tradition of his time, who drew a southern continent at the bottom of his map because that is what cartographers of his time did. The specific form of the southern continent on the Piri Reis map is consistent with the forms it takes on contemporaneous European maps. It is large, it is connected to or close to the known southern landmasses, it has a roughly east-west coastline, and it is decorated with marginal text describing its hypothetical features. All of these are characteristics of the Terra Australis as it appears on other maps of the same period. Now let me address the specific claims Hapgood made about the match between the Piri Reis southern landmass and the Antarctic coastline, because they deserve careful examination. Hapgood argued that the southern landmass showed features, bays, peninsulas, rivers, that match specific features visible in the seismic survey data of Antarctica's subglacial topography. He presented a series of comparisons in maps of the ancient sea kings, showing outlines of the Piri Reis southern landmass superimposed on maps of the Antarctic coastline, with claimed correspondences marked. The first problem with these comparisons is methodological. Hapgood reprojected the Piri Reis map before making the comparison, using his assumption about the projection center to transform the map's geometry. As we discussed in the previous part of tonight's journey, this reprojection is based on an assumption, the CNA projection center, that was not independently established. The comparisons he presents are therefore comparisons between a transformed version of the Piri Reis map and the Antarctic coastline, not between the map as drawn and the Antarctic coastline. If the transformation is wrong, if the projection center was not at Syene, then the comparisons are meaningless, because the transformation will have introduced distortions that produced whatever correspondence Hapgood thought he found. This is not a minor methodological quibble. It goes to the heart of whether the comparison is valid. The second problem is the quality of the claimed correspondences. When cartographers and geographers who did not start from the assumption that the map shows Antarctica examined the comparisons, they found them unconvincing. The features that Hapgood matched between the Piri Reis map and the Antarctic coastline are either very general, broad curves and indentations that could be matched to almost any irregular coastline, or are matched at the expense of ignoring other features that do not correspond. This is the classic problem of pareidolia applied to cartography. The human visual system is extraordinarily good at finding patterns, at seeing faces in clouds, animals in rock formations, and correspondences between maps and coastlines, when the observer is strongly motivated to find them. The proper test of whether the Piri Reis map shows Antarctica is not whether an observer who believes it shows Antarctica can find correspondences between the two. It is whether an independent observer with no prior assumption about what the map shows would identify the Antarctic coastline as the best match for the Piri Reis southern landmass among all possible coastlines. When this kind of independent quantitative test has been applied, when cartometric methods have been used to measure the degree of correspondence between the Piri Reis southern landmass and a range of possible coastlines including Antarctica, the results have not supported Hapgood's claim. The Piri Reis southern landmass does not correspond to the Antarctic coastline at a level significantly better than chance. The third problem is specific to the subglacial topography argument. Hapgood claimed that the Piri Reis map matched not just the general outline of Antarctica, but the specific subglacial topography, the shape of the land beneath the ice, as revealed by the International Geophysical Year surveys. This is the specific form of the claim that makes it most extraordinary, not just that Antarctica was mapped when it was ice-free, but that the maps accurately captured the features of the land surface that have been invisible beneath kilometres of ice for thousands of years. The subglacial topography of Antarctica was first systematically mapped in 1957 to 1958. The data showed that beneath the ice, Antarctica has a complex topography of mountains, valleys, and basins that differ significantly from the smooth-surfaced continent the ice sheet presents from above. Hapgood argued that features visible in this subglacial data matched features on the Piri Reis map. The problem is that the subglacial topography data of the 1950s was itself very coarse. The resolution of seismic surveys of the period was sufficient to reveal the general shape of the subglacial surface, but not its fine detail. The subsequent decades of more detailed surveying have produced a much more precise picture of the Antarctic subglacial topography. When comparisons are made between the Piri Reis map and the modern, higher-resolution subglacial topography data, the claimed correspondences are even less convincing than when compared to the coarser 1950s data that Hapgood used. This is the opposite of what you would expect if the Piri Reis map genuinely showed the Antarctic coastline. A real cartographic record of the ice-free Antarctic coastline should match the subglacial topography better as the subglacial data becomes more precise, not worse. The fact that the correspondence deteriorates as the data improves is evidence against the hypothesis. Let me now address one more specific aspect of the counter-argument, the question of what the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map actually represents, if not Antarctica. The most credible scholarly interpretation is that the southern landmass represents a speculative extension of the South American coastline, combined with the conventional Terra Australis of 16th century European cartography. The specific form it takes on the Piri Reis map, connected to South America in the upper part, curving east across the bottom of the map, is consistent with what you would expect from a cartographer who was following the south-running South American coastline and, reaching the limit of his source's knowledge, extended it eastward in the conventional direction of the Terra Australis. This interpretation is supported by the marginal notes which describe the southern landmass in terms consistent with South American fauna and climate rather than Antarctic ice and cold. It is supported by comparison with contemporary maps, which show the same pattern of southward extension and eastward curve. And it is supported by the absence of any feature of the Piri Reis map that requires the ancient Antarctica hypothesis to explain it. The southern landmass is not mysterious. It is conventional. It is what you would expect from a skilled 16th century cartographer working in the tradition of his time, and understanding it as such does not diminish Piri Reis or his map. It simply gives us an accurate picture of what he was doing. And that accurate picture is genuinely interesting enough. Let me develop the Terra Australis tradition in more depth, because understanding how it worked across several centuries of European cartography illuminates the specific moment when Piri Reis was drawing his map. The Terra Australis tradition evolved through three distinct phases. The first phase, running from ancient Greek cosmological speculation through Ptolemy and into the medieval period, was purely theoretical. The southern continent existed as a logical necessity, something that had to be there to balance the world, without any claim to observational basis. Medieval maps that show a southern continent are showing a theoretical entity, not a geographical discovery. The second phase began in the late 15th century, when Portuguese exploration of the South Atlantic started to provide actual observational data about the nature of the Southern Ocean. When Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, he demonstrated that the Indian Ocean was connected to the Atlantic, that there was open sea to the south of Africa, not the closed southern continent that Ptolemaic maps had shown. This was a significant revision of the Ptolemaic picture, and cartographers had to adjust. The adjustment was revealing. Rather than simply removing the southern continent, most cartographers moved it further south. They preserved the theoretical entity, but relocated it to a region where exploration had not yet reached. The Terra Australis incognita became genuinely unknown rather than merely hypothetical. It was placed beyond the frontier of exploration rather than in a region that had been shown to be open ocean. This is the phase in which Piri Reis was working. In 1513, the South Atlantic had been partly explored. Portuguese and Spanish vessels had reached the southern coast of South America, had sailed into the waters between South America and the hypothetical southern continent. But they had not confirmed or denied the existence of a large landmass at high southern latitudes. The Terra Australis remained possible in the light of the available evidence, and cartographers continued to show it. The third phase began in the late 17th and 18th centuries, when systematic exploration of the Southern Ocean by Bouvet, by Cook, by by d'Urville, progressively reduced the area where the Terra Australis could plausibly exist. Cook's second voyage of 1772 to 1775, which crossed the Antarctic Circle 3 times and found only open sea south of approximately 60 degrees latitude over most of the circumference, was particularly decisive. The Terra Australis retreated to the region that turned out to be actually occupied by it, the high-latitude continent that would be confirmed in 1820. This history is important for the Piri Reis debate because it shows that the southern continent on the Piri Reis map is part of the second phase of the Terra Australis tradition, the phase when the continent had been moved south of the explored regions, but remained a legitimate geographical hypothesis. Piri Reis was not doing something unusual. He was doing what every competent cartographer of his time did, drawing the Terra Australis in the region where the available evidence left open the possibility of its existence. The correspondence between the Piri Reis southern landmass and the general region of Antarctica is therefore not evidence of a secret ancient knowledge of Antarctica. It is evidence that the Terra Australis tradition pointed in the direction of the region where Antarctica actually is, because that is where the unexplored high southern latitudes are, and that is where the Terra Australis was placed as exploration progressively narrowed the region of possibility. Now let me also think about the specific kind of argument that the Antarctica hypothesis represents, because its logical structure is worth examining for what it reveals about a common pattern in alternative history claims. The Antarctica hypothesis begins with a genuine observation. The Piri Reis southern landmass does, in some general ways, resemble the Antarctic coastline. This is not false. The general region of the southern Atlantic does contain Antarctica, and the Piri Reis map shows something in the general southern region. The question is whether this general resemblance is meaningful or coincidental. To move from general resemblance to ancient Antarctic survey, the hypothesis requires several additional steps, each of which introduces uncertainty. The map must be reprojected from an assumed center to make the resemblance more specific. The reprojected map must be compared to the Antarctic coastline, and the comparison must show a match that is better than chance. The match must be shown to be better with the subglacial topography than with the surface topography to support the specific claim about ice-free Antarctica. And an explanation must be provided for how the ancient survey data reached Piri Reis in 1513. Each of these steps fails under scrutiny. The projection center assumption is circular. The match, when tested quantitatively, is not significantly better than chance. The subglacial argument deteriorates as the topographic data improves. And no plausible mechanism exists for the transmission of ancient Antarctic survey data across thousands of years to a 16th century Ottoman admiral. When an extraordinary hypothesis requires a chain of steps, each of which fails to meet the evidentiary standard, the conclusion is not that the hypothesis has been proved in some approximate way. The conclusion is that the hypothesis has not been established. The general resemblance between the Piri Reis map and Antarctica remains what it was at the beginning. A general resemblance between a speculative, early 16th century southern continent and the actual continent that occupies the region, those speculative maps were pointing toward. That is all the Piri Reis map shows. It is interesting. It is historically significant as a record of the state of geographical knowledge at the dawn of the age of global exploration. But it is not a record of an ancient Antarctic survey. And the specific claim that it is, made by Hapgood and repeated by countless popular writers since, is an extraordinary claim for which the evidence is insufficient. Let me spend more time with Hapgood, not to dismiss him, but to understand him properly. In part 3 of tonight's journey, I gave you the outline of Hapgood's argument and the basic context of his career. But there is more to say about the specific intellectual qualities that made his work both compelling and problematic, about the tradition of thought it belongs to, and about what it means to take an unconventional position in scholarship. Hapgood was, by the accounts of those who knew him, a genuinely curious and genuinely careful thinker who was unwilling to accept conventional answers when the conventional answers seemed to him unsatisfactory. He was also someone who had perhaps too much confidence in his own ability to identify patterns in complex evidence, who saw genuine signals in what was, in some cases, noise. This combination, genuine curiosity, careful documentation, and a willingness to overinterpret evidence in service of a compelling hypothesis, is not uncommon among the most interesting scholarly mavericks. It produces work that is worth engaging with seriously, that raises real questions, and that sometimes identifies genuine anomalies that mainstream scholarship has ignored. It also produces work that is systematically biased toward confirmation of the hypothesis the researcher started with. Hapgood's work on ancient maps fits this description precisely. He was genuinely curious about the question of what ancient cartographers knew and where their knowledge came from. He documented his sources carefully and worked through the technical details of map projection with genuine diligence. And he reached conclusions that went considerably beyond what his evidence could support, driven by a compelling hypothesis about an ancient civilization with advanced cartographic capabilities. Let me now examine Hapgood's geological theory in more depth, because it is the foundation of the broader alternative prehistory framework into which the map evidence was fitted. Hapgood's theory of Earth crust displacement, which he also called the theory of polar wandering, proposed that the outer crust of the Earth, sitting on a viscous mantle, could periodically shift as a whole, moving the positions of all the continents simultaneously relative to the rotational poles. In Hapgood's model, such shifts could occur relatively rapidly, on the timescale of thousands rather than millions of years, and could move the poles by large distances. He proposed that the most recent such shift occurred between approximately 17,000 and 12,000 years ago, moving Antarctica from a temperate or subpolar position, where it could have supported a warm climate and an ice-free coastline, to its current polar position, where it has accumulated the ice sheet it now bears. This shift in Hapgood's framework was the mechanism that allowed an ancient civilization to survey an ice-free Antarctica before the shift occurred. The geological problems with this theory are fundamental and multiple. First, the theory of Earth crust displacement is not consistent with the geological evidence for the age and origin of the Antarctic ice sheet. The current ice sheet began forming approximately 34 million years ago, when the Drake Passage opened between South America and Antarctica and established the Antarctic circumpolar current that thermally isolated the continent. The ice sheet has varied in extent across glacial cycles over the past several million years, but it has not been absent from Antarctica for anything close to 12,000 years. The geological record, ice cores, marine sediment cores, and the geomorphology of the Antarctic landscape itself is unambiguous on this point. Second, the theory is not consistent with the modern understanding of plate tectonics. The movement of the Earth's surface relative to its interior does occur, but it occurs through the slow movement of individual plates over tens and hundreds of millions of years, not through rapid shifts of the entire crust as a unit. The specific mechanism Hapgood proposed, a coherent crust sliding over a viscous mantle, is not how the Earth's interior works. Third, a rapid shift of the entire crust would produce catastrophic geological and climatic effects. Massive earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions on a scale orders of magnitude greater than anything in the historical record. There is no evidence in the geological record for such an event occurring in the last 17,000 years. These are not minor objections that can be addressed by refining the theory. They go to the core of the physical mechanism Hapgood proposed. The theory requires the Earth to behave in ways that the geological evidence shows it does not behave. Einstein's letter, written in 1955 before Hapgood published Earth's Shifting Crust, acknowledged the theoretical possibility of crust displacement, while stopping well short of endorsing the specific geological evidence or the specific timeline Hapgood proposed. Einstein wrote that the thought of such a displacement of the polar axis was not in itself absurd, but he explicitly noted that he could not form a judgment on the specific geological and geographical evidence without expert knowledge of those fields. Einstein was being intellectually honest. He was acknowledging that the general physical concept of polar displacement was not obviously impossible, while appropriately declining to assess evidence that was outside his expertise. Hapgood, or more precisely, the popular tradition that has grown up around Hapgood's work, has taken this modest expression of theoretical openness and presented it as Einstein's endorsement of the specific claims in the book. This is a misrepresentation that tells us something important about the sociology of alternative history. When a famous scientist says something that can be interpreted as supportive of an unconventional position, that interpretation is extracted, amplified, and repeated until it has taken on a life independent of what the scientist actually said. The Einstein letter has been quoted in support of Hapgood's ideas for 70 years, and in most of those quotations, what Einstein actually said and what Einstein actually endorsed have been collapsed into a single misleading claim. The broader alternative prehistory framework that Hapgood's work helped to establish has been enormously influential. The idea that an ancient civilization with advanced knowledge existed before the conventional timeline of civilization, an idea that Hapgood's work on ancient maps was used to support, has been developed and popularized by numerous writers in the decades since Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings was published. Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods, published in 1995, drew heavily on Hapgood's work and presented the Antarctic maps as central evidence for a lost pre-flood civilization. The book sold millions of copies and spawned a genre of alternative history writing that continues to the present. The popularity of this tradition is a genuine cultural phenomenon that deserves sociological understanding, even as the specific historical and scientific claims it makes deserve critical scrutiny. The appeal of the lost civilization narrative, the idea that there is a hidden chapter of human history that explains the apparent gaps and anomalies in the conventional timeline, is real and is connected to legitimate questions about what ancient peoples were capable of. But the specific evidence that the alternative history tradition relies upon, including the Piri Reis map, does not support the extraordinary conclusions drawn from it. The map is interesting. The tradition of ancient cartography is interesting. The question of what ancient peoples knew about the geography of the world is interesting. What is not supported is the conclusion that any of this evidence points to an advanced ancient civilization with Antarctic surveys. Hapgood was a serious scholar who asked real questions. The answers he found were wrong, and the tradition that built itself on his answers has multiplied the errors many times over. Understanding why the answers were wrong, what specific methodological mistakes Hapgood made, and what a correct methodology would look like, is more valuable than simply noting that he was wrong. It is a lesson in how to think about anomalous evidence, a lesson that applies far beyond the specific case of the Piri Reis map. Let me think about what the tradition that Hapgood helped establish tells us about the sociology of scientific authority, about how unconventional claims circulate, why they attract believers, and what makes them so resistant to correction. The alternative history genre, of which Hapgood's work is a foundational text, has a specific and recognizable structure. It begins with genuine anomalies, real features of the archaeological or historical record that the conventional explanation handles imperfectly. It identifies these anomalies and presents them compellingly, often in vivid and accessible prose, that makes them feel more significant than they might appear in technical scholarship. It then proposes an alternative explanation, the lost civilization, the ancient sea kings, the advanced prehistoric culture, that explains all the anomalies at once. The appeal of this structure is the appeal of the unified theory. Mainstream archaeology explains each anomaly separately, with different explanations for different sites and different periods. The alternative history tradition explains all the anomalies together, with a single overarching narrative that gives each individual anomaly meaning as part of a larger pattern. This unified narrative is more satisfying, more coherent, and more memorable than the collection of separate conventional explanations. But the satisfaction of the unified narrative is not evidence of its truth. The history of science shows many examples of unified theories that were compelling, coherent, and memorable, but wrong. The phlogiston theory of combustion explained all the known facts about burning in a unified and satisfying way. It was wrong. The steady-state theory of the universe had an elegance and simplicity that the Big Bang theory initially lacked. The steady-state theory was wrong. The question is not whether an alternative narrative is more satisfying than the conventional explanation. The question is whether it is better supported by the evidence. And in the case of the alternative history tradition, the answer is consistently no. The anomalies that alternative history identifies are real, but the alternative explanations for them are not supported by the evidence. The conventional explanations, fragmented, imperfect, lacking the elegance of the unified narrative, are better supported. The alternative history tradition has also developed specific rhetorical strategies for dealing with this evidential situation. One is to argue that the conventional explanation has been suppressed, that mainstream academics have a vested interest in the conventional timeline and have actively prevented the evidence for the alternative from being properly examined. This argument allows the alternative historian to explain the absence of mainstream acceptance without engaging with the specific reasons that the mainstream has rejected the claims. Another strategy is to argue from the authority of credentialed figures who expressed interest in the alternative claims, figures like Einstein in the case of Hapgood, or figures who have since become associated with the genre. This allows the alternative historian to present the claims as having mainstream scientific endorsement, when in fact the endorsement is either misrepresented or amounts only to an expression of interest rather than a scientific assessment. A third strategy is to keep moving the goalposts, to acknowledge specific refutations of specific claims while maintaining the overall hypothesis unchanged. When a specific comparison between the Piri Reis map and the Antarctic coastline is shown to be unconvincing, the alternative historian finds a different comparison, a different projection, a different portion of the map to compare. The hypothesis is never definitively tested against the evidence because it is always being reformulated to avoid the specific objections that have been raised. These strategies are not unique to alternative history. They appear in various forms in many areas of human inquiry where strongly held beliefs resist disconfirmation. But they are particularly visible in the alternative history tradition because the tradition has been arguing for the same basic claims: the lost civilization, the ancient sea kings, the advanced prehistoric culture. for more than half a century, across dozens of books and thousands of articles, without the claims ever being established to the satisfaction of the mainstream scholarly community. The persistence of the claims, despite the absence of convincing evidence, is itself something that deserves to be understood rather than simply dismissed. It reflects a genuine human need, the need for the world to be larger and stranger and more interesting than the official account allows. The conventional history of the world, with its gradual development of civilization from agricultural beginnings, is in many ways a story of increasing control and decreasing mystery. The alternative history tradition offers a different kind of story, one in which there are things the experts don't know, things the official account is missing, hidden depths to the human past. This is a legitimate emotional need. The world is more interesting when it contains genuine mysteries, and the history of human achievement, including the achievement of mapping the coastlines of distant continents, is genuinely inspiring. The Piri Reis map is part of that inspiring story, just not in the way that Hapgood thought. Let me also spend time with the specific question of what a legitimate revision of the history of ancient geographical knowledge would look like, because I want to be clear that the critique of Hapgood's specific claims is not a defense of the idea that ancient peoples knew nothing about the world beyond their immediate horizon. Ancient geographical knowledge was extensive and in some respects surprising. The Phoenicians, as we discussed in an earlier video in this series, were sailing the entire length of the Mediterranean and had established colonies in Spain and North Africa, and possibly beyond, by the first millennium BCE. Greek geographers in the classical period had a remarkably accurate sense of the general shape and extent of the inhabited world, based on trade routes and the reports of travellers and navigators. Arab geographers of the medieval period had a detailed knowledge of the coasts of the Indian Ocean, the East African coast, and parts of the Pacific that reflected centuries of maritime trade. The specific question of whether any pre-European culture reached Antarctica before 1820 is a different question from the general question of what ancient peoples knew about their world. The former requires a specific answer: no. The geological, archaeological, and cartographic evidence is clear that Antarctica was not reached by any human culture before the 19th century. The continent is too remote, too cold, and too difficult to approach for the maritime technologies of the ancient and medieval world. But the general question, how extensive was the geographical knowledge of ancient and medieval cultures, and does the conventional account adequately represent it, is a legitimate and interesting question that deserves serious engagement. The answer to that question, based on the best available evidence, is that ancient and medieval geographical knowledge was both more extensive than popular accounts sometimes suggest, and less extensive than the alternative history tradition claims. The Phoenicians may have circumnavigated Africa before Vasco da Gama. Polynesian navigators reached almost every inhabitable island in the Pacific centuries before European exploration. Arab traders had detailed navigational knowledge of the Indian Ocean coasts long before Portuguese exploration brought that knowledge into European cartography. These are real achievements of ancient and medieval geographical knowledge that deserve to be better known and more fully appreciated. They do not require the lost civilization hypothesis. They do not require Antarctic surveys by prehistoric peoples. They are the achievements of real peoples whose maritime and navigational capabilities were genuinely extraordinary by the standards of their time. The Piri Reis map is part of this story, not as evidence of an ancient Antarctic survey, but as a remarkable synthesis of the geographical knowledge of the early 16th century. It reflects the Phoenician-derived Mediterranean cartographic tradition, the Arabic navigational knowledge of the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese discoveries of the African and American coasts, and the specific perspective of an Ottoman admiral who had sailed many of the seas that the map represents. That is a remarkable story. It does not need to be embellished, and understanding it accurately is more respectful of the genuine achievement of Piri Reis and his sources than the fantasy of ancient Antarctic maps could ever be. Let me explain map projections properly, because they are central to the technical debate about the Piri Reis map, and because they are genuinely interesting in their own right. A map projection is the mathematical system used to represent the curved surface of the Earth on a flat sheet of paper. This is a problem with no perfect solution. The Earth is a sphere, or more precisely, an oblate spheroid, slightly flattened at the poles, and you cannot unfold or flatten a sphere onto a flat surface without distorting it. Every map projection preserves some properties of the Earth's surface at the expense of distorting others. The most familiar projection to most modern eyes is the Mercator projection, developed by the Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator in 1569. The Mercator projection preserves angles. A straight line on a Mercator map represents a line of constant compass bearing, which makes it useful for navigation. But it distorts areas, making regions far from the equator appear much larger than they are relative to regions near the equator. Greenland appears roughly the same size as Africa on a Mercator projection, but Africa is actually about 14 times larger. Other projections preserve area instead of angle, producing maps where the relative sizes of land masses are correct, but where shapes and angles are distorted. Still others preserve neither area nor angle, but minimize some combination of distortions to produce a visually balanced map suitable for wall display. Every projection has a center point, a specific location on the Earth's surface where the projection distorts the geometry least, and from which distortions increase as you move further away. Different projections treat this center point differently. Some are centered on the equator, some on a specific meridian, some on a specific location on the Earth's surface. The choice of projection affects how the mapped features are positioned relative to each other and how they appear when you look at the flat map. A coastline that appears to run north-south on one projection may appear to run northeast-southwest on a different projection centered on a different point. The same geographical area can look very different depending on the projection used. This matters for the Piri Reis debate because Hapgood's entire reprojection argument depends on identifying the specific projection that the ancient source cartographers used when they surveyed Antarctica, and then correcting the Piri Reis map by reversing that projection to recover the original accurate coastline. The first problem, as I noted in part 3, is identifying the projection center. Hapgood argued that the ancient source cartographers used a projection centered on a specific point. He proposed various candidate locations across the course of his work, settling eventually on Syene, Egypt, as his preferred center point. But the method he used to identify this center point was not rigorous. A cartometrician, a specialist in the mathematical analysis of maps, approaching this problem correctly would first analyze the internal geometry of the Piri Reis map to identify the mathematical relationships between known geographical features. If the map was drawn using a consistent projection, those relationships should conform to the mathematical properties of some specific projection centered on some specific point. The cartometrician would then use the mathematical analysis to identify which projection and which center point best fits the observed geometry. This is not what Hapgood did. Hapgood did not have the mathematical training or the computational tools for this kind of analysis. He worked visually, comparing outlines on paper and making qualitative assessments of correspondence. His identification of Syene as the projection center was based partly on visual analysis. partly on theoretical reasoning about what center point an ancient cartographer in the Egyptian tradition might have used, and partly on the fact that using Syene as the center produced a southern landmass that looked more like Antarctica than using other candidate points. The circularity here is decisive. If you choose your projection center based on which center produces the best match with the hypothesis, if you are, in effect, fitting the projection to the desired outcome rather than determining the projection independently, then you cannot use the match as evidence for the hypothesis. You have guaranteed the match by the way you chose the projection. Subsequent cartometric analysis of the Piri Reis map, conducted by researchers with the mathematical training and the computational tools that Hapgood lacked, has not confirmed his projection analysis. The internal geometry of the map does not conform consistently to any single projection centered on any specific point. This is consistent with what we know about the map's construction. It was synthesized from many different source charts, each with its own projection or lack of formal projection, and the combination of multiple inconsistent sources produces a map whose internal geometry is itself inconsistent. A map whose internal geometry is inconsistent cannot be analyzed as if it were drawn using a single projection. There is no single projection to identify and reverse. Any attempt to reproject such a map using an assumed projection center will produce arbitrary transformations that reflect the assumptions of the reprojector rather than the intentions of the original cartographers. The second major technical problem with Hapgood's analysis is the quality of the match between the reprojected Piri Reis southern landmass and the Antarctic coastline. Hapgood's comparisons were made by hand. He drew outlines of the relevant features on transparent paper, overlaid them on maps of Antarctica, and assessed the degree of correspondence visually. This is an inherently imprecise method, and it is one that is particularly vulnerable to motivated cognition. When you are looking for a correspondence, you will find it. The human visual system is extraordinarily sensitive to similarities and extraordinarily good at ignoring differences when it is primed to find a match. The proper cartometric method for assessing the correspondence between two outlines is quantitative. You identify a set of specific, well-defined reference points on both outlines, specific capes, bays, and headlands that can be unambiguously identified on both maps, and measure the distances and angles between them on each outline. If the outlines correspond, the distances and angles should be consistent across all the reference points. If they do not correspond, you will find systematic discrepancies. Some pairs of reference points matching well, and others not matching at all. When researchers have applied this quantitative method to the comparison between the Piri Reis southern landmass and the Antarctic coastline, the results have been unambiguous. The correspondence is not significantly better than chance. The specific features that Hapgood identified as matching are matched at a level that would be expected from any roughly similar irregular coastline. The specific features that Hapgood did not identify as matching are discrepant at a level that would be expected from two completely unrelated coastlines. This result has been confirmed by multiple independent researchers using different quantitative methods. It is one of the clearest cases in the history of alternative cartographic scholarship where a claim that was initially assessed visually has been definitively refuted by quantitative analysis. The third technical problem is specific to the subglacial topography argument. Even if the Piri Reis southern landmass did correspond to the general shape of Antarctica's coastline, which the quantitative analysis shows it does not, this would not specifically support the claim that the map shows the subglacial topography rather than the surface topography. The general shape of a continent is relatively similar whether you are mapping the surface or the subglacial topography. The major differences are in fine detail, not in broad outline. Hapgood's claim that the map matched the subglacial topography better than the surface topography was based on a comparison with the limited seismic data available in the late 1950s. When the comparison is made with the more detailed subglacial topographic data produced by subsequent decades of surveying, the claimed match deteriorates. The higher resolution data shows more specific features of the subglacial landscape that do not correspond to features on the Piri Reis map. This is, as I noted in Part 4, the opposite of what you would expect from a genuine cartographic record. If the Piri Reis map was drawn from a real survey of the ice-free Antarctic coastline, it should match the subglacial topography more closely as the data about that topography improves. The fact that it matches less closely as the data improves is strong evidence against the hypothesis. Let me close this part by saying something about what a correct analysis of the Piri Reis map's southern landmass would look like, what the right questions are and what the right methods are for addressing them. The right question is not whether the Piri Reis southern landmass looks like Antarctica when reprojected from an assumed center. The right question is, what geographical sources did Piri Reis use for the southern portion of his map, and how accurately do those sources represent the geographical knowledge available in the early 16th century? This question can be addressed by comparing the southern portion of the Piri Reis map with other maps of the same period that show the same region, by examining the marginal notes for clues about the specific sources used, and by analysing the cartographic conventions used in the southern portion to determine which tradition of mapping they belong to. When this analysis is conducted, the answer is consistent. The southern portion of the Piri Reis map represents the same speculative southern continent that appears on other maps of the period, drawn from the same theoretical tradition and the same limited observational data about the South Atlantic. It is not an anomaly. It is the expected product of a skilled cartographer working in the tradition of his time. The map is remarkable without being mysterious. The cartographer was extraordinary without having access to impossible knowledge. That is the honest answer. And honest answers in the small hours of the night are worth more than compelling fictions. Let me think more carefully about what the cartometric analysis of the Piri Reis map tells us about how we should read ancient maps in general, because the methodological lessons of this specific case have broader application. Before the development of modern cartometric analysis, before the computational tools that allow quantitative comparison of map features, the study of historical maps was largely qualitative. Scholars described maps, compared them visually, noted similarities and differences. This qualitative approach was appropriate to the questions it was asking. What did this map show? How does it compare to other maps of its time? What tradition of cartography does it belong to? But when the questions shift from the qualitative to the quantitative, when the claim is not just that a map shows a particular region, but that it shows that region with a specific degree of accuracy, or that it corresponds to a specific geographical area to a degree better than chance, then qualitative visual analysis is no longer adequate. Quantitative claims require quantitative evidence. This is the specific methodological failure of Hapgood's work. He was asking quantitative questions. Does this map correspond to the Antarctic coastline? And answering them with qualitative methods. The visual impression of correspondence is not the same as a measured correspondence, and the measured correspondence, when tested, does not support the visual impression. The development of cartometric analysis as a discipline in the second half of the 20th century has transformed the study of historical maps in ways that are not always appreciated in popular accounts. Researchers like John Snyder, whose work on map projections is foundational to the field, and the practitioners of modern digital cartometric analysis have developed rigorous mathematical methods for characterizing the projections used in historical maps, measuring their accuracy, and comparing them quantitatively to modern geographical data. These methods have produced genuine insights into the history of cartography. The application of cartometric analysis to Portolan charts, for example, has revealed that these medieval Mediterranean charts were produced using a consistent and remarkably accurate projection. More consistent and more accurate than their pre-scientific production methods would suggest, and suggestive of a sophisticated underlying methodology that is still not fully understood. This is a real mystery in the history of cartography. How did medieval chart makers achieve the accuracy visible in Portolan charts without the formal, mathematical methods of modern cartography? The answer is presumably in the accumulated observational data of generations of Mediterranean navigators, combined with specific empirical methods for combining that data into a consistent map. But the specific methods are not documented, and the cartometric evidence alone cannot reconstruct them. The Piri Reis map is interesting precisely because it is a synthesis, because it combines sources from multiple traditions, multiple regions, and multiple periods, and because the way it handles the regions for which it had good data differs from the way it handles the regions for which it had poor data. The cartometric analysis of the map reveals this structure. The Mediterranean and North Atlantic sections, drawn from the accumulated data of the Portolan tradition, are relatively accurate. The South American sections, drawn from Spanish and Portuguese exploration charts that were only a few decades old, are less accurate. And the southern section, drawn from theoretical convention rather than observational data, is speculative. This is exactly the structure you would expect from a skilled Renaissance cartographer working with heterogeneous sources. The cartometric analysis confirms the historical interpretation. The Piri Reis map reflects the state of geographical knowledge at the dawn of the age of global exploration, with different regions represented at very different levels of accuracy, depending on the quality of the available sources. There is no anomaly. There is no ancient Antarctic survey. There is a remarkable early 16th century map whose structure, when properly analysed, is entirely consistent with its historical context. Understanding this is more satisfying in a specific and important way than the alternative history interpretation. It gives us a precise and accurate picture of what Piri Reis was doing and why. It connects the map to a specific historical moment. The moment when European and Ottoman knowledge of the world was expanding rapidly, when new information was arriving from explorers and navigators faster than cartographers could incorporate it, when the maps being drawn were at once more accurate than anything before them, and still full of the speculative extensions and theoretical conventions of the pre-exploration tradition. That specific historical moment is one of the most interesting in the entire history of cartography, and the Piri Reis map is one of its most remarkable documents, not because it proves the existence of ancient sea kings, but because it shows in a single piece of gazelle skin the precise line between what was known and what was imagined at a singular moment in the history of human geographical knowledge. Let me give you the honest accounting. After 6 parts of tonight's journey, through the map's history, through Hapgood's argument, through the Terra Australis tradition, through the cartometric analysis, what can we say with confidence about the Piri Reis map? The map is real. It was drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman naval officer and cartographer of exceptional skill and learning. It represents a remarkable synthesis of the geographical knowledge available in the early 16th century, drawn from Turkish, Arab, Greek, Portuguese, and Spanish sources. It is one of the most important cartographic documents of the age of exploration. These facts are not in dispute. The map shows the Atlantic world with varying degrees of accuracy. The European and North African coasts are relatively accurate, reflecting the accumulated navigational knowledge of the Portolan tradition. The Atlantic islands are correctly placed. The South American coast is rendered with the approximate accuracy you would expect from charts only a decade or two old. These observations are confirmed by both visual comparison and quantitative cartometric analysis. The map shows a southern landmass at the bottom. This landmass is drawn with deliberate attention, decorated with illustrations, and accompanied by marginal notes describing its features. It is a real feature of the map. These observations are not in dispute. The southern landmass does not represent Antarctica. The evidence for this conclusion comes from multiple independent lines of analysis. The southern landmass is part of the Terra Australis tradition that was standard in European and Ottoman cartography of the period. The marginal notes describe warm tropical conditions inconsistent with Antarctica. The quantitative cartometric analysis shows no correspondence with the Antarctic coastline significantly better than charts. The projection analysis required to support the Antarctica hypothesis is methodologically flawed, and the pattern of correspondence between the map and the subglacial Antarctic topography deteriorates as the topographic data improves, which is the opposite of what a genuine record would show. This is the scholarly consensus on the Piri Reis map, and it is a consensus reached by multiple independent researchers using multiple independent methods. It is not a consensus born of institutional defensiveness or unwillingness to consider evidence. It is a consensus born of sustained, rigorous analysis of the available evidence. Let me now say something specific about what the scholarly consensus does not claim, because the honest accounting goes in both directions. The scholarly consensus does not claim that the history of ancient cartography is fully understood. There are genuine mysteries in the history of maps, questions about how medieval chartmakers achieved the accuracy of the Portolan tradition, questions about the sources of geographical knowledge in the ancient and medieval world, questions about the transmission of geographical information across cultural and linguistic boundaries. These are real questions that deserve serious investigation. The scholarly consensus does not claim that ancient peoples were incapable of impressive geographical achievements. The Polynesian navigators who settled the Pacific, the Phoenician traders who may have circumnavigated Africa, the Arab geographers who produced detailed maps of the Indian Ocean world. These are real achievements of ancient geographical knowledge that are sometimes underappreciated in popular accounts. The conventional history of exploration is skewed toward the European story and can give the misleading impression that no one else was exploring the world before Vasco da Gama. The scholarly consensus does not claim that all the geographical knowledge encoded in early modern European maps can be fully traced to known historical sources. The specific origin of some features of some early modern maps remains unclear, and the possibility that some cartographic knowledge came from sources whose history we cannot trace is real. The history of cartographic transmission is complex and incompletely understood. What the scholarly consensus does claim is that the specific claim that the Piri Reis map shows Antarctica, with the specific implication that an advanced ancient civilization surveyed the ice-free Antarctic coastline, is not supported by the evidence. The specific technical arguments that have been advanced in support of this claim are methodologically flawed, and the broader framework of ancient sea kings and earth crust displacement that Hapgood developed to make the claim coherent is contradicted by the geological evidence. This is a specific and limited claim. It does not say that everything about the early history of geographical knowledge is understood. It says that this specific claim about this specific map is not supported by the evidence. Now let me think about why the claim has been so persistent. Why the Antarctica hypothesis has continued to attract believers for more than half a century after the scholarly community reached its consensus against it. One reason is that the story is compelling. The image of ancient navigators mapping Antarctica before the ice came, of a lost chapter of human history preserved in a fragment of 16th century vellum, is genuinely beautiful as a story. It has the specific narrative appeal of hidden knowledge and secret history that resonates with many people. Another reason is that the refutation requires technical knowledge that is not accessible to non-specialists. The cartometric analysis, the map projection mathematics, the geological evidence about Antarctica's ice sheet. These are specialist topics that require significant technical background to evaluate. The popular accounts of the alternative history tradition present the positive case in accessible, vivid prose. The scholarly refutations are typically written for specialist audiences in technical language. This asymmetry and accessibility is a real challenge for public understanding of the issue. It is not the fault of the scholars who refuted Hapgood's claims. They were writing for their professional audience, as is appropriate for scholarly work. But it means that most people who have heard of the Piri Reis map have encountered the alternative history version of the story rather than the scholarly consensus. The honest accounting, fairly presented and in accessible language, is the appropriate response to this asymmetry. The map is remarkable. The cartographer was extraordinary. The age of exploration he lived in was transformative, and the southern landmass on his map is a speculative conventional feature of 16th century cartography, not a record of ancient Antarctic surveys. That is the truth of the matter. It is also, when you understand it fully, a genuinely interesting truth. A truth about the specific historical moment when human beings were for the first time piecing together a picture of the whole world, getting some parts right, getting some parts wrong, filling in the unknown with theory and convention and the specific intellectual traditions they had inherited from the ancient world. That moment of transition, from partial knowledge to attempted completeness, is one of the most interesting moments in the history of human thought. And the Piri Reis map is one of its most vivid documents. Let me develop that point more fully, because I think the map's historical significance, as distinct from its alternative history significance, is genuinely worth exploring, and it tends to get lost in the debate about Antarctica. The year 1513 was an extraordinary moment in the history of geographical knowledge. Columbus had made his first voyage only 21 years earlier. Vasco da Gama had reached India only 15 years earlier. Magellan's circumnavigation would not be completed until 1522, 9 years in the future. The Americas had been known to European cartographers for barely 2 decades. The existence of a continuous oceanic connection between the Atlantic and the Pacific, a connection that made global circumnavigation possible, had not yet been demonstrated. In this context, Piri Reis was working at the absolute frontier of contemporary geographical knowledge. He was drawing coastlines that had been explored within living memory, using charts that were barely a decade old, synthesizing information from navigators who were in some cases still alive and still sailing. The American coastlines on his map are not the product of centuries of accumulated observation. They are almost as new as the news that the continents existed at all. The specific challenge that Piri Reis faced was the challenge of synthesis. He had access to charts from multiple different traditions: Turkish, Arab, Portuguese, Spanish, Greek, each of which represented the world differently, used different conventions, different scales, and different levels of accuracy. Combining these into a single coherent map required the specific skills of a trained cartographer, working in a rich tradition, and the skill with which he executed the synthesis is visible in the resulting map. The regions that are most accurately represented on the Piri Reis map are the regions where the accumulated data was most consistent and most extensive: the Mediterranean, the North African coast, the Atlantic islands. These are the regions that the Portolan tradition had been mapping for centuries, where the navigational data was deep and reliable. The regions that are least accurately represented are the regions where the data was thinnest: the far south, the unknown Pacific, the interior of continents. This gradient of accuracy, from reliable in the known regions to speculative in the unknown ones, is itself informative. It tells us how knowledge worked at this historical moment, not as a complete and consistent picture of the world, but as a patchwork of regions known with varying degrees of precision, combined by cartographers who did their best to stitch them together into a coherent whole. The southern landmass sits at the speculative end of this gradient. It is where the known runs out and the theoretical takes over. It is the boundary between what exploration had established and what cosmological convention required. Understanding it as such, as the specific historical boundary of knowledge in 1513, is far more illuminating than understanding it as a mysterious record of ancient Antarctic surveys. Let me also think about the specific quality of the map as an object, as a physical artifact that has survived 5 centuries and that carries in its ink and its vellum the specific moment of its making. The Piri Reis map is not just a source of geographical information. It is a human document, the product of a specific person's mind, training and experience, made at a specific historical moment and preserved by a combination of institutional circumstance and good fortune. When you look at the map, or at a high-quality reproduction of it, you are looking at the specific trace of Piri Reis's hand, his pen moving across the vellum, his choices about where to draw a coastline and where to leave it speculative. Those choices were informed by everything he knew: his years at sea, his reading of the geographical literature, his access to the charts and navigational guides that formed his collection, his conversations with navigators and merchants and officials who had information about distant coasts. The map is a record of that knowledge network, as much as it is a record of the world's geography. The marginal notes make this explicit. Piri Reis writes about his sources, his methods, his understanding of what he is doing. He is not just drawing a map. He is recording where his knowledge comes from and what he thinks it means. This reflexivity, this awareness of the process of making geographical knowledge, is one of the most striking features of the map's accompanying text. The specific moment of the map's rediscovery in 1929 is also worth dwelling on. For more than 4 centuries, one of the most significant cartographic documents of the age of exploration was sitting in the archive of a palace, folded and largely unexamined. The knowledge it contained, of the state of geographical knowledge in 1513, of the specific sources Piri Reis used, of the conventions of early 16th century Ottoman cartography, was inaccessible. When Deisman opened that drawer in 1929 and unfolded the vellum, he was recovering a piece of the historical record that had been lost. Not lost in the dramatic sense of a fire or a flood, simply unfiled, unindexed, overlooked. The archive is full of such recoveries of documents that waited centuries for someone to notice them. The Piri Reis map waited more than 4 centuries, and when it was found, it was immediately recognized as extraordinary. Not because it showed Antarctica, but because it showed the world as Piri Reis knew it. And that world at that moment was genuinely extraordinary. Let me think about what it means that an alternative history claim about this map has outlasted all the scholarly refutations of it by more than half a century. This persistence tells us something about the relationship between evidence and belief that is worth examining carefully. In an ideal world, the process would be simple. A claim is made, evidence is examined. The evidence is found insufficient. The claim is abandoned. In the real world, claims that serve emotional or narrative functions tend to persist long after the evidence against them has been established, because the function they serve is not primarily evidential. The Antarctica hypothesis serves a function that has nothing to do with the specific claim about a map. It serves the function of making the world larger and stranger than the official account. It serves the function of suggesting that there is hidden knowledge, that the experts are wrong, that the conventional story is incomplete. These functions are valuable to many people, and they do not disappear when the specific evidence for the claim is refuted. The appropriate response to this situation is not to dismiss the people who find the alternative history tradition compelling. They are responding to a real human need, the need for the world to be more interesting than the mundane account. And they are often drawn to the tradition by genuine curiosity about the ancient world, genuine frustration with dismissive mainstream scholarship, and genuine interest in the questions that the tradition raises, even if its specific answers are wrong. The appropriate response is to do what good scholars have always done, to engage seriously with the genuine questions the tradition raises while being clear and honest about the specific claims that are not supported by evidence. The genuine questions about ancient geographical knowledge are interesting. What did the Phoenicians know about the world beyond the Mediterranean? How did Polynesian navigators orient themselves across thousands of kilometres of open ocean? What cartographic methods produced the accuracy of the medieval Portolan charts? These are questions that deserve serious investigation, and the alternative history tradition has sometimes drawn attention to them in ways that mainstream scholarship had not. The Piri Reis map raises genuine questions too. Where exactly did the southern landmass come from? Which specific source charts did Piri Reis use for the different sections of the map? How did geographical knowledge flow between the Turkish, Arab, Portuguese, and Spanish traditions that all contributed to the map? These are questions that historical scholars are actively investigating. The answers to those questions will not reveal ancient Antarctic surveys, but they will reveal something genuine and interesting about how geographical knowledge worked at the most exciting cartographic moment in human history. That is worth knowing. Let me tell you about the maps that do present genuine puzzles. Having spent several parts of tonight's journey establishing what the Piri Reis map does not show and why the Antarctica hypothesis is not supported by the evidence, I want to turn to the history of cartography and identify the places where the genuine mysteries are. The maps and the geographical documents that raise real questions about what ancient and medieval peoples knew, and that the conventional account of the history of exploration has difficulty explaining. These genuine anomalies are worth knowing about. They demonstrate that the history of geographical knowledge is genuinely complex and genuinely incompletely understood. They justify the general impulse, however misdirected its specific applications, to look carefully at ancient and medieval maps for things that the conventional history does not explain. The first genuine anomaly I want to discuss is not specifically a map, but a tradition of geographical knowledge. The question of whether the Phoenicians circumnavigated Africa. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, describes a circumnavigation of Africa by Phoenician sailors sent by the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II. According to Herodotus, the Phoenicians sailed south from the Red Sea, rounded the southern tip of Africa, and returned to Egypt through the Mediterranean. Herodotus himself says he does not believe the most remarkable detail of this account. The sailors report that as they rounded the southern tip of Africa, the sun was on their right, to the north. Herodotus disbelieved this because it was inconsistent with his understanding of geography. But it is exactly what you would expect from a sailor rounding the Cape of Good Hope from east to west. They would indeed have the sun to the north, in the northern sky, because they were south of the equator. The specific detail that Herodotus dismissed as implausible is actually the most convincing evidence that the account is genuine. No physical remains of a Phoenician voyage around Africa have been found. The account in Herodotus is the only direct evidence. But the Herodotus account has the specific quality of authentic ancient reports. It contains a detail that the author finds implausible, but reports anyway because it was told to him. A fabricated account would not include a detail that the fabricator's own audience would find implausible. The inclusion of the paradoxical solar observation is strong evidence that Herodotus was reporting something that actually happened, even if he could not understand why it happened. If the Phoenicians did circumnavigate Africa in the late 7th or early 6th century BCE, it would be one of the most remarkable feats of ancient navigation, accomplished more than 2,000 years before Vasco da Gama's voyage of 1497. And it raises the question of what geographical knowledge was preserved and transmitted from this voyage, and whether any of that knowledge eventually found its way into medieval or Renaissance maps. The second genuine anomaly is the Fra Mauro map. Fra Mauro was a Venetian monk who worked at the Camaldolese monastery on the island of Murano in the lagoon of Venice. Around 1450, he produced what is arguably the greatest map of the medieval period, a circular world map approximately 2 meters in diameter, drawn on vellum mounted on a wooden frame, showing the known world from Ireland to Japan and from Scandinavia to sub-Saharan Africa. The Fra Mauro map is extraordinary for its detail, its accuracy in many regions, and its incorporation of information from a vast range of sources. Arab geographical texts, Chinese geographical accounts transmitted through the Mongol Empire, Portuguese exploration of the West African coast, and the accumulated knowledge of the Venetian trading network that extended from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea to the Indian Ocean. One of the most discussed features of the Fra Mauro map is a note it contains about a voyage around the southern tip of Africa by a ship described as a junk, a Chinese vessel, which Fra Mauro says occurred approximately 40 years before the map was made, which would place it around 1410. This would put the voyage around 1420 CE, approximately 70 years before Bartolomeo Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope from the European perspective. Whether this note represents a genuine Chinese circumnavigation of Africa, a confused reference to an Arab voyage, an invented detail, or some other event, is debated. The note has attracted enormous attention from historians of exploration and has not been definitively resolved. It is one of the genuine mysteries of pre-Columbian geographical knowledge. The third genuine anomaly is the accuracy of the Portolan charts for the Mediterranean, which we discussed in the context of the Piri Reis map, but which deserves more attention as a genuine puzzle in its own right. The Portolan charts of the 13th century onwards show the Mediterranean coastline with a precision that is not fully explained by the navigational methods available at the time. The charts are accurate enough that modern GPS measurements confirm specific port positions to within a few kilometres, a level of accuracy that far exceeds what you would expect from estimates of distance based on sailing time and observations of the sun and stars. The specific puzzle is this. Portolan charts do not use latitude and longitude. They are not drawn with reference to any formal mathematical coordinate system. They are drawn with reference to compass bearings and distances, the navigational data that Mediterranean sailors accumulated over centuries. And yet, the resulting charts are geometrically accurate in ways that formal coordinate systems are designed to achieve, and that compass and distance methods are not supposed to be capable of. How did medieval chart makers achieve this accuracy? The question has been the subject of sustained scholarly investigation and has not been fully resolved. The most plausible explanations involve the systematic combination of very large numbers of individual navigational observations. More observations than any single cartographer could have made, accumulated over many decades by many navigators. But the specific methods by which those observations were combined and the specific tradition that developed those methods are not documented. This is a genuine mystery in the history of cartography. It is not a mystery that requires an ancient advanced civilization to explain. The Portolan charts were demonstrably produced in medieval Europe by medieval European chart makers. But the specific methods they use to achieve their accuracy are genuinely unknown. The fourth genuine anomaly is the question of pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the Americas. The conventional account holds that Columbus's voyage of 1492 was the first contact between the Old World and the Americas, after the Norse settlement of Vinland around 1000 CE. But the evidence for this conventional account is less clear than popular accounts suggest. Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki voyage demonstrated that prehistoric peoples with simple technology could have crossed the Pacific. Genetic studies of indigenous American populations have found evidence of contact with Polynesian populations in the pre-Columbian period. The specific question of whether any Old World population reached the Americas before Columbus, in addition to the Norse, is a genuine open question in historical research. This question matters for the history of cartography because pre-Columbian contact with the Americas might explain certain features of pre-Columbian world maps that are otherwise difficult to account for. If Mediterranean or Arab or Chinese sailors reached the Americas before Columbus, they might have accumulated geographical knowledge that found its way into medieval maps, not in the specific form of recognizable American coastlines, but in the form of vague or distorted geographical information about lands to the west. None of these genuine anomalies supports the Antarctica hypothesis. They do not require an ancient advanced civilization with Antarctic surveys. They are mysteries within the framework of what we know about ancient and medieval navigational capability, not mysteries that require us to posit capabilities far beyond what the evidence supports. But they demonstrate that the history of ancient and medieval geographical knowledge is genuinely rich, genuinely complex, and genuinely not fully understood. The impulse to look carefully at ancient maps for things the conventional account does not explain is a legitimate impulse. The specific direction in which that impulse led Charles Hapgood toward Antarctic surveys and Earth crust displacement was the wrong direction. But the impulse itself was not wrong. And the genuine mysteries that remain in the history of cartography are worth pursuing, with better methods and more honest expectations. Let me develop the Portolan chart mystery more fully, because I think it is the most illuminating of the genuine cartographic anomalies, the one that tells us the most about how geographical knowledge actually worked in the ancient and medieval world. The Portolan charts were not produced by any single cartographic program or any single institution. They were produced by individual chart makers in Genoa, Venice, and Majorca. Commercial craftsmen who made charts for sale to mariners. The methods they used were not formalized in any treatise that has survived. We know they produced charts of extraordinary accuracy. We do not know exactly how. One of the most interesting aspects of the Portolan chart mystery is its negative space, what is missing from the charts. Portolan charts of the Mediterranean are accurate. Portolan charts that extend to cover the Atlantic coastlines of Europe and Africa, drawn in the same tradition by the same chart makers using the same methods, are less accurate. And Portolan charts that extend to cover the newly discovered Americas are substantially less accurate than either. This gradient, from highly accurate in the familiar Mediterranean to progressively less accurate in the less familiar Atlantic, is consistent with the hypothesis that the Portolan chart accuracy was a function of the accumulated observational data. The Mediterranean had been navigated by Mediterranean cultures for thousands of years. The data pool was enormous. The Atlantic coast of Europe and Africa had been navigated for centuries, but not as intensively. The Americas were new. If this hypothesis is correct, if the Portolan accuracy was a function of data density rather than of any special method or instrument, then the mystery of Portolan accuracy is the mystery of how medieval chartmakers combined very large data sets into consistent representations without formal mathematical tools. This is still a genuine mystery, but it is a mystery about medieval information processing, not a mystery about ancient advanced civilizations. It is a mystery that can, in principle, be resolved by better understanding of how medieval chartmakers worked, by finding documentation of their methods, or by reverse engineering those methods from the patterns visible in the surviving charts. The Phoenician circumnavigation question raises a different kind of mystery, a mystery about what geographical knowledge was accumulated by ancient mariners, and how much of it was preserved and transmitted to later cultures. If the Phoenicians did circumnavigate Africa in the 6th century BCE, what happened to that knowledge? Was it recorded? Was it transmitted to Greek geographers who incorporated it into their understanding of world geography? Did any of it find its way into the geographical tradition that eventually influenced medieval and Renaissance cartographers? These questions cannot be answered with certainty from the available evidence, but they point to a real gap in our understanding of how ancient geographical knowledge was accumulated and transmitted. The conventional history of exploration gives the impression that systematic geographical knowledge began with the European age of exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries. The Herodotus account of the Phoenician circumnavigation and other ancient accounts of long-distance voyages suggests that the conventional impression is wrong. Ancient mariners knew more about the world than the conventional history credits. Some of that knowledge was lost. Some may have been preserved in forms we have not yet fully recognized. The genuine task for the history of cartography is to recover that knowledge carefully, to trace the transmission of geographical information across cultures and centuries, to identify the sources that ancient and medieval cartographers used, to understand the specific mechanisms by which navigational knowledge became cartographic knowledge. This is painstaking historical work. It does not produce dramatic revelations about lost civilizations, but it produces genuine understanding of how human beings have known their world, of the long, complex, imperfectly documented process by which the vague and fragmentary geographical knowledge of the ancient world was eventually compiled into the accurate global maps of the modern era. The Piri Reis map is part of that process, not the anomaly that proves an ancient Antarctic survey, but a window into the specific moment when Mediterranean, Arab, Portuguese, and Spanish geographical knowledge was being combined into a new synthesis that would, within a few generations, produce the first accurate world maps. That is a genuine contribution to human understanding, and it deserves to be recognized as such. Let me close this part with a specific point about the Vinland map, which I promised to discuss, and which represents one of the most instructive cases in the history of cartographic controversy. The Vinland map is a parchment map that purports to date from the mid-15th century and to show, among other features, a large island in the western Atlantic labelled Vinlanda Insula, the island of Vinland, which is generally interpreted as representing the Norse settlement of North America. The map came to public attention in 1965 when it was acquired by Yale University and announced in a scholarly publication as a genuine medieval document that provided pre-Columbian cartographic evidence of the Norse discovery of North America. The Vinland map generated enormous scholarly controversy. If genuine, it would be the earliest known cartographic depiction of any part of the Americas. But from the beginning, many scholars expressed doubts about its authenticity. The style of the parchment, the style of the script, the specific features of the map's geography, and the colour of the ink all raised questions. In 1974, analysis of the ink showed the presence of anatase, a form of titanium dioxide that is used as a white pigment in modern paint, but that was not produced in a form consistent with the ink's appearance until the 20th century. This analysis strongly suggested that the map was a modern forgery, not a medieval original. The anatase finding was disputed. Counter-analyses argued that the titanium dioxide could have been produced naturally, or that the sample used in the 1974 analysis had been contaminated. The controversy continued for decades, with successive analyses reaching different conclusions. The current scholarly consensus, based on the most recent and most sophisticated chemical analysis, is that the Vinland map is a 20th century forgery. The evidence points to a creation date in the 1920s or 1930s, possibly by the Croatian Franciscan monk and historian Vinko Pribojević, or by some other forger using similar methods. The Vinland map case is instructive for several reasons. First, it shows that cartographic forgeries do occur, that maps claiming to represent ancient geographical knowledge are sometimes fabricated, and that the fabrications can be sophisticated enough to deceive specialist scholars. Second, it shows that the correct response to claims about ancient maps is careful, independent, multidisciplinary analysis, not immediate acceptance because the claim fits a desired narrative. Third, and most importantly, it shows that even forgeries can illuminate genuine historical questions. The Vinland map, if forgery it is, was constructed using genuine medieval cartographic conventions and genuine historical knowledge about Norse exploration. The forger, whoever they were, was not making up geography. They were producing what a genuine medieval map of Norse voyages might have looked like, based on knowledge of Norse exploration and medieval cartographic traditions. The forgery tells us something real about what a medieval cartographer with knowledge of the Norse voyages might have drawn. The Piri Reis map is not a forgery. It is a genuine product of early 16th century Ottoman cartography. But the lesson of the Vinland map applies. The meaning of any historical map depends not just on whether the map is genuine, but on what specific knowledge and what specific conventions went into its making. Understanding the Piri Reis map correctly means understanding the specific knowledge and the specific conventions of 1513 Ottoman cartography. That is the task, and it is a worthwhile one. Let me tell you what Piri Reis actually had in front of him when he drew the map. This is a question that has been studied carefully by historians of cartography, and the answers are more specific and more interesting than the vague invocation of 20 sources that appears in popular accounts. Understanding Piri Reis's actual sources is the key to understanding the map, both what it accurately represents and where its speculative features come from. Piri Reis himself is our best guide to his sources because he wrote about them extensively. In the marginal notes of the 1513 map and in his later work, the Kitab-i Bahriye, a comprehensive illustrated guide to the coasts of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, produced in multiple editions between 1521 and 1526. He describes his methods, his sources, and his understanding of geography with considerable specificity. The Kitab-i Bahriye is one of the most remarkable works of navigational literature in the history of seafaring. It contains over 200 illustrated maps of specific coastal regions, ports, bays, islands, harbours, accompanied by detailed sailing directions for each. It is simultaneously a practical navigator's guide and a work of geographical scholarship. drawing on Piri Reis's own extensive sailing experience and on a wide range of written and cartographic sources. For the 1513 map, the sources that Piri Reis describes fall into several categories. The most important category for the Atlantic portions of the map is what he calls the Frankish maps, the charts of Portuguese and Spanish navigators that had been accumulated since the beginning of the Age of Exploration. Piri Reis had access to these charts through the specific circumstances of his uncle Kemal Reis's career as a privateer and Ottoman naval officer, which brought him into contact with Spanish and Portuguese navigators in both hostile and commercial contexts. The specific claim about Columbus's charts deserves careful examination. Piri Reis writes in the marginal notes that one of his sources was a chart drawn by Columbus in the West. He also describes a Spanish prisoner who had sailed with Columbus on 3 voyages and who provided information about the New World. Some scholars have interpreted these as references to actual charts produced by Columbus. Others are more cautious, noting that the description is ambiguous and may refer to charts based on Columbus's voyages rather than charts produced by Columbus himself. What is not disputed is that Piri Reis had access to the charts that were circulating in the Spanish and Portuguese navigational world in the first decade of the 16th century. Charts that reflected 2 decades of exploration of the Atlantic and the Americas. The accuracy of the American coastline sections of the Piri Reis map is consistent with the state of this Spanish and Portuguese knowledge around 1510 to 1513. The second major category of sources is the Arab geographical tradition. Piri Reis was working in the Ottoman world, and the Ottoman geographical tradition drew heavily on the accumulated knowledge of Arab geographers stretching back to the 9th and 10th centuries CE. Arab geography at its height, in the works of al-Idrisi, al-Masudi, and Ibn Battuta, represented the most comprehensive geographical knowledge in the world, drawing on the Islamic trade networks that connected the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, the East African coast, the Persian Gulf, and the coasts of India and Southeast Asia. The Arab geographical tradition was particularly strong in its knowledge of the Indian Ocean world, the eastern coasts of Africa, the coasts of Arabia and Persia and India, and the major trade routes that connected them. This knowledge had been accumulated over centuries by Arab, Persian, and Indian ocean traders, and it was encoded in Portolan-style charts of the Indian Ocean that Piri Reis had access to. The third major category of sources is the Ptolemaic tradition. As we discussed in the context of the Terra Australis, Ptolemy's 2nd century CE geographical work dominated European and to some extent Islamic geographical thinking through the Renaissance. Piri Reis had access to Ptolemaic maps and incorporated the Ptolemaic framework into his synthesis, using it for the general structure of the world while updating specific regions with newer information. The Ptolemaic tradition is relevant to understanding the southern landmass because the Ptolemaic world map included a large southern continent that enclosed the Indian Ocean. This Ptolemaic southern land was distinct from the later Terra Australis incognita, but contributed to the cartographic convention of expecting a major landmass in the southern hemisphere. When Piri Reis drew his southern landmass, he was drawing in a tradition that had roots both in the theoretical Terra Australis and in the Ptolemaic enclosed ocean model. The fourth category of sources is Piri Reis's own sailing experience and the oral testimony of navigators he had encountered in the course of his career. This category is the hardest to evaluate because it is the least documented. We cannot know precisely what specific geographical information Piri Reis absorbed from conversations with navigators, or what his own direct experience at sea contributed to his geographical knowledge. But Piri Reis was an experienced sailor who had navigated the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. He had been present at naval engagements in distant waters. He he had encountered navigators from many different maritime traditions in the course of his career. The experiential and conversational basis of his geographical knowledge was broad and deep, in a way that no written source can fully capture. The synthesis that Piri Reis made from these diverse sources is what makes the map remarkable. He was not simply copying existing maps. He was combining information from multiple inconsistent sources, making judgments about which sources were most reliable for which regions, and producing a unified representation that was more comprehensive than any of his individual sources. This synthesis is visible in the map's internal structure. The Mediterranean and North Atlantic sections show the high accuracy of the Portolan tradition. The newly discovered American coastlines show the accuracy of the Spanish and Portuguese exploration charts. The Indian Ocean sections, visible in the eastern portion of the surviving fragment, show the accuracy of the Arab navigational tradition. And the southern landmass shows the speculative extensions of the Ptolemaic and Terra Australis traditions. Each section reflects the specific character of its sources. The map is, in a specific sense, a map of the sources as much as a map of the world. It shows in its varying accuracy across different regions the varying quality of the geographical knowledge available to Piri Reis in 1513. Understanding the sources also helps explain one of the most discussed specific features of the map: the apparent accuracy of the South American coastline in certain respects. The Piri Reis map shows the eastern coast of South America running roughly south and then turning east in a way that some observers have found surprisingly accurate for its date. The explanation is the Spanish and Portuguese charts that Piri Reis had access to. By 1513, Spanish and Portuguese navigators had explored a significant portion of the South American coastline. Cabral had reached Brazil in 1500. Amerigo Vespucci had explored the coast further south, and successive Portuguese and Spanish voyages had accumulated detailed knowledge of the Atlantic coast of South America to at least 30 or 40 degrees south latitude. The accuracy of the South American coastline on the Piri Reis map is therefore not mysterious. It is precisely what you would expect from a skilled cartographer who had access to charts reflecting a decade of Spanish and Portuguese exploration of that coastline. The mystery of the Piri Reis map is not that it shows things that should not be knowable. The mystery, the genuine, interesting, historically illuminating mystery, is how Piri Reis obtained and synthesized the specific sources that made his map possible, and how the specific mixture of accurate observational knowledge and conventional theoretical extension that characterizes the map reflects the state of geographical knowledge at the dawn of the age of global exploration. That mystery is entirely within the reach of historical investigation, and it is a more interesting mystery, honestly engaged with, than the fantasy of ancient Antarctic surveys. Let me develop the Kitab-i Bahriye more fully, because it is one of the great works of navigational literature, and it illuminates the specific quality of Piri Reis's geographical mind. The Kitab-i Bahriye, which translates roughly as Book of the Sea, was produced in multiple editions. The first edition, around 1521, was a working navigator's guide, detailed, practical, focused on the specific harbours and anchorages and hazards that an Ottoman naval officer navigating the Mediterranean would need to know. The later editions, produced in the 1520s, were grander in scope and ambition, dedicated to the Sultan, illustrated with elaborate maps, and expanded to cover a broader geographical range. The expansion from the working guide to the imperial presentation reflects something important about Piri Reis's ambitions and his understanding of his own work. He was not simply a practical navigator producing a tool for use at sea. He was a geographer in the full sense, someone who understood geography as a form of knowledge about the world, with significance for understanding human civilization, the extent of Ottoman power, and the relationship between the known and the unknown. The Kitab-i Bahriye contains maps of individual harbours and coastal regions that are among the most detailed and accurate maps of those regions produced in the 16th century. The map of the harbour of Alexandria, for example, shows the layout of the port with a specificity that reflects direct observation or access to very detailed pilot's information. The map of Istanbul shows the city and its harbours in a form consistent with direct familiarity. These detailed local maps are complemented by the written sailing directions. The actual pilot's text that describes the hazards, the anchorages, the depths, and the distances that a navigator approaching each port would need to know. This combination of map and text is characteristic of the Portolan tradition at its best: the map for orientation and the text for practical detail. The Kitab-i Bahriye also contains material that goes beyond the practical. The preamble to the later editions contains a discussion of cosmography, of the shape and size of the Earth, of the relationship between the known world and the unknown, of the implications of the recent discoveries for the understanding of global geography. This cosmographical material draws on both the classical tradition and the Islamic geographical tradition, and it reflects Piri Reis's engagement with the broader intellectual questions that the age of exploration was raising. Understanding Piri Reis through the Kitab-i Bahriye gives us a much richer picture of him than the alternative history tradition typically presents. He was not a passive conduit for ancient knowledge, passing on Antarctic surveys that had somehow survived from prehistoric times. He was an active, engaged, intellectually ambitious geographer who was trying to understand and represent the world as it was known in his time. His ambition was to synthesize, to take the diverse and sometimes contradictory geographical knowledge available in the early 16th century and produce a coherent representation of the world that would be both practically useful and intellectually satisfying. The 1513 map is the product of that ambition. Its southern landmass is not a mystery carried forward from prehistory. It is the product of Piri Reis's specific judgments about how to represent the unknown southern regions of the world. Judgments informed by the Ptolemaic tradition, the Terra Australis convention, and his own understanding of what lay beyond the explored frontier. Now let me also say something about the specific knowledge exchange between the Ottoman and European cartographic traditions that the Piri Reis map embodies. The Ottoman Empire in the early 16th century occupied a pivotal geographical position in the world of geographical knowledge. It controlled the major land routes between Europe and Asia. Its ports connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Its merchants and sailors had access to geographical information from Arabic, Persian, Indian, and Chinese sources that was simply not available to European cartographers. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire was deeply interested in the European discoveries that were transforming the world's geography. The Spanish and Portuguese explorations had strategic implications for Ottoman power. The Portuguese route around Africa threatened the Ottoman control of the spice trade, one of the major sources of Ottoman commercial wealth. The Ottoman court was keenly interested in what the Portuguese had found and how their discoveries changed the strategic geography of the world. Piri Reis was working in this environment of intense strategic interest in geographical knowledge. His access to Spanish and Portuguese charts was not accidental. It reflected the Ottoman Empire's active effort to acquire information about European discoveries that had strategic implications. The captured Spanish prisoner who provided information about Columbus's voyages was one node in a larger network of intelligence about European exploration that the Ottoman court was maintaining. The 1513 map is therefore also a document of Ottoman intelligence gathering, of the specific information about European discoveries that had reached the Ottoman court by 1513, and that a senior naval officer like Piri Reis could access. This context makes the map's accuracy in the American sections even more explicable. Piri Reis was not working from vague second-hand accounts. He was working from actual charts captured or obtained from Spanish sources that reflected the best available Spanish knowledge of the American coastlines as of the first decade of the 16th century. The map is what it is, a remarkable product of a specific historical moment in a specific political and intellectual context, made by a specific person of exceptional skill and learning. It does not need to be more than that. What it is, understood correctly, is already extraordinary. Let me think about the specific question of what was lost when Piri Reis eventually fell from favor and was executed. What geographical knowledge and what cartographic skill died with him? Piri Reis was executed in 1553, approximately 40 years after the 1513 map was drawn. In those 40 years, he had continued his cartographic and navigational work, producing additional maps and revisions of the Kitab-i Bahriye. He had also accumulated additional geographical knowledge. The Portuguese had continued their exploration of the Indian Ocean world. The Spanish had mapped more of the Americas, and the Ottoman Empire's own naval activities had extended Piri Reis's personal knowledge of the waters he operated in. His execution, ordered by the Ottoman court on grounds related to a military failure in the Persian Gulf, cut short the work of a man who was still intellectually active and still producing geographical scholarship into his 80s. What additional maps or texts he might have produced had he lived longer is unknowable. What he left behind, the 1513 map fragment, the Kitab-i Bahriye, and the 1528 map of the Atlantic and the Americas that also survives, is extraordinary enough. The 1528 map, which is sometimes discussed in the context of the Piri Reis myth, but which has attracted less popular attention than the 1513 map, is in some respects more historically significant. It shows the Americas with considerably more accuracy than the 1513 map, reflecting 15 additional years of Spanish and Portuguese exploration. It shows a recognizable North America for the first time in surviving Ottoman cartography. It is evidence of Piri Reis's continued engagement with the geographical discoveries of his age, updating his picture of the world as new information became available. The two surviving Piri Reis maps together trace an arc of rapidly expanding geographical knowledge, from 1513, when the Americas had been known to European cartographers for barely 2 decades, to 1528, when the general shape of the American continents was becoming clearer. Piri Reis was tracking this expansion of knowledge in real time, updating his maps as new information reached him. This is what genuine cartographic scholarship looks like. Not the invocation of ancient sources whose existence cannot be demonstrated. Not the reliance on mysterious knowledge that predates all known civilization, but the patient, diligent, intellectually engaged work of a skilled cartographer, incorporating new information into an evolving picture of the world. The Piri Reis myth does a disservice to the real Piri Reis. It replaces a genuine historical figure of remarkable achievement with a passive conduit for prehistoric knowledge. The real Piri Reis was far more interesting. He was doing what the best scientists and scholars have always done, working at the frontier of what was known, synthesizing the available evidence, making his best judgment about what the evidence implied, and remaining open to revision as new evidence arrived. That is the Piri Reis who deserves to be remembered. Let me think about why maps fascinate. Not this map specifically, not the Piri Reis map with its contested southern landmass and its alternative history mythology. Maps in general. The specific quality of human attention that maps attract and hold. The specific way in which looking at a map is different from looking at any other representation of the world. A map is a claim about the world. It says, this is what the world looks like from above. reduced to a manageable scale, with the important features marked and the unimportant ones omitted. It is a claim that involves enormous selectivity, enormous choices about what to include and what to leave out, what to emphasize and what to minimize, what to mark as known and what to mark as unknown. Every map embodies a perspective, a particular way of seeing the world that reflects the interests, the values, and the knowledge of the people who made it. Medieval European maps placed Jerusalem at the center of the world because Jerusalem was understood as the spiritual center of the world that mattered. Chinese maps from the same period placed China at the center because China was understood as the center of the civilized world. The Mercator projection, which became the standard for world maps in the 16th century and remains widespread today, places the equator below the visual center of the map, making Europe and North America appear larger than their actual size relative to the tropics. These choices are not neutral. They encode a view of what matters and what is peripheral, what is large and what is small, what is central and what is marginal. The history of cartography is the history of these choices. The history of how different cultures and different historical moments have encoded their worldview in the representation of space. The Piri Reis map embodies the worldview of an early 16th century Ottoman naval officer. It places the Mediterranean at the center, which is where the accumulated knowledge of the Portolan tradition was most dense and most reliable. It extends to the Americas in the west because the Spanish and Portuguese discoveries had made the Americas newly relevant to anyone thinking about maritime power and trade. It shows the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea because these were strategically important waters for the Ottoman Empire. And it shows a speculative southern land because the conventions of its time required that something be shown there. Reading the map as a representation of this perspective, as a window into how an educated Ottoman navigator of 1513 understood the world, is far more illuminating than reading it as a mysterious repository of ancient knowledge. It connects the map to a specific historical moment and a specific human mind, and it allows us to understand the map as an expression of that mind's engagement with the world. Maps also fascinate because they make the abstract concrete. The world is enormous, too large to be directly experienced by any individual human being, spread across distances that take lifetimes to traverse. A map makes the world visible and graspable. It allows you to see, in a glance, relationships between places that would otherwise be unimaginable, the relative position of continents, the shape of coastlines, the distances between ports. This is a specifically cognitive gift. The visual system is extraordinarily powerful. It can process spatial relationships and patterns with a speed and a precision that verbal description cannot match. A map gives the visual system a representation of spatial relationships that the mind can process and retain in ways that lists of distances and directions cannot. The map is a memory palace for the world. For ancient and medieval peoples, maps were also instruments of power. The ability to represent the world, to make the unknown visible, to capture the shape of distant coastlines and the positions of faraway cities, was the ability to project power into those distant spaces. A cartographer who could map your enemy's coastline before your fleet arrived, there was providing a strategic advantage of enormous value. This is why navigational charts were state secrets in early modern Europe. The Portuguese jealously guarded their charts of the African coast and the Indian Ocean. The Spanish protected their charts of the Americas. The specific knowledge encoded in a navigational chart, the depth of the water, the position of shoals, the location of harbours, was commercially and militarily valuable, and it was treated accordingly. Piri Reis's access to Spanish charts reflected the specific permeability of these secrets. Maps leaked, navigators talked, charts were captured in battle or obtained through commercial contact. The specific knowledge that empires tried to protect was, like all valuable information, difficult to keep secret against the determined efforts of rivals to obtain it. The 1513 Piri Reis map is itself a product of this leakage, a synthesis of Portuguese and Spanish knowledge that an Ottoman admiral had accumulated through the specific channels of his career. Now, let me think about the specific quality of the incomplete map, the map with blank spaces, with speculative extensions, with the specific regions that have not yet been explored filled in with convention or theory. There is something specifically compelling about the edge of the known. The line where accurate representation gives way to speculation, where the cartographer's confident pen becomes hesitant, where the known world meets the unknown. This is where the Piri Reis southern landmass is, at the edge of the known, at the boundary between the explored and the unexplored, at the specific moment in 1513 when the world was still being mapped. The blank spaces on old maps, the Here Be Dragons regions, the Terra incognita that fills the empty vellum, have a specific hold on the human imagination. They represent the unknown, which is both threatening and attractive. They invite the imagination to fill in what the map cannot show. They are the cartographic equivalent of the darkness beyond the campfire, the space that the light of knowledge has not yet reached. The Piri Reis southern landmass is a specific kind of filling in of the blank. It is not quite dragon country. It has the form of a real landmass, decorated with real-seeming features. But it is filling in nonetheless. A representation of a region that had not been explored, drawn in accordance with the conventions of the time and the theoretical expectations of the cartographic tradition. What makes it interesting? What makes all edges of the known interesting is the specific quality of the boundary between knowledge and speculation. On one side of that boundary, the map is telling you something about the world. On the other side, it is telling you something about the mind that made it. The southern landmass of the Piri Reis map tells us something about how a 16th century Ottoman cartographer thought about the unknown south. It tells us about the conventions he had inherited, the theoretical framework he was working within, the specific blend of empirical and speculative that characterized early modern cartography. That is what the southern landmass is. Not a record of an ancient Antarctic survey, but a record of the specific quality of a specific mind at a specific moment in history. And that record is worth reading carefully, not for the secrets it might contain, but for what it reveals about what it means to try to represent a world that is larger than you can see. Let me develop that thought further, because I think it gets at something important about the specific kind of knowledge that maps represent. A map is always a model, a simplified representation of reality that preserves some features of the reality while omitting others. The choices about what to preserve and what to omit are not arbitrary. They reflect a theory about what matters, what features of the world are important enough to include, what level of detail is necessary to make the map useful, what distortions are acceptable in exchange for the ability to represent the whole. These choices are made by real people in real historical circumstances. The cartographer who draws a map is making a series of judgments about importance and relevance that reflect their cultural context, their practical needs, and their cognitive model of the world. The resulting map is a document of those judgments as much as it is a document of the world it represents. This is why old maps are so historically valuable. They are not just records of what the world looked like, though they are that too. They are records of how the people who made them understood the world, what they knew, what they thought they knew, what they wanted to know, and how they handled the boundary between knowledge and ignorance. The Piri Reis map, read this way, is a document of an extraordinary moment of transition. A moment when the world was being remapped in real time, when accumulated knowledge from multiple traditions was being combined into a new synthesis, when the boundary between the known and the unknown was moving in ways that no one had experienced before. The people who lived through the age of exploration did not know they were living through a revolution in geographical knowledge. They knew the world was getting larger, that new coasts were being discovered, new peoples encountered, new trade routes opened. But they could not see the full arc of the transformation from the inside. They were living it, not studying it. Piri Reis was living it. He was a working navigator and a working geographer at the moment when the Mediterranean world, the world that the Portolan tradition had been mapping for centuries, was being connected to a much larger world that the Mediterranean cartographers had only dimly imagined. The 1513 map captures this connection at the moment of its making. It shows the old world of the Portolan tradition and the new world of the Atlantic exploration in a single synthesis. It shows where the knowledge is dense and where it is thin. It shows where the empirical gives way to the theoretical, where the accurate gives way to the speculative. That is a remarkable thing to show, and it took a remarkable person to show it. Now let me think about the specific way in which the Piri Reis map has been misread, not just by Hapgood and the alternative history tradition, but by everyone who has encountered it, expecting it to be something other than what it is. When people encounter the Piri Reis map for the first time, they typically encounter it through the alternative history frame. They have been told that the map shows Antarctica. They approach it looking for Antarctica. And because the southern landmass of the map is in the right general direction and has a roughly east-west orientation at the bottom of the map, they find what they are looking for. This is the specific cognitive mechanism that makes the Antarctica hypothesis so persistent. The confirmation bias that operates when you approach a complex, ambiguous image with a specific expectation. You see what you are looking for because the visual system is extraordinarily good at finding the pattern you are primed to find. The corrective to this mechanism is not just providing the correct historical information, though that is necessary. The corrective is learning to look at the map on its own terms, without the frame of Antarctica, without the frame of ancient sea kings, without the frame of any alternative history hypothesis. When you look at the Piri Reis map without those frames, when you look at it as what it is, a remarkable early 16th century cartographic synthesis, you see something genuinely extraordinary. You see the Mediterranean rendered with the authority of centuries of accumulated navigational knowledge. You see the Americas rendered with the specific limitations of charts that were only a decade old. You see the South rendered with the specific conventions of a cartographic tradition that was trying to represent a region it had not explored. You see a mind at work, a specific, historically situated, extraordinarily capable mind, making the best possible representation of the world it knew, and acknowledging, in the speculative extensions of the southern landmass, the limits of that knowledge. That is what maps do. They show you what is known, and they show you, in the conventions they use for what is not known, what the cartographer imagined was there. Both kinds of showing are valuable. Both tell you something real about the world, and both deserve careful, honest attention. Let me close this part with a reflection on the specific relationship between the map and the cartographer, between the object that survives and the person who made it, because I think it is one of the most poignant aspects of the Piri Reis story. Piri Reis died in 1553. In the 5 centuries since his death, his work has been studied by historians of cartography, celebrated by Turkish scholars as a monument of Ottoman intellectual achievement and co-opted by alternative history writers as evidence of ancient Antarctic surveys. He has been interpreted, misinterpreted, celebrated and distorted in ways that would be unrecognizable to the person who actually made the map. What Piri Reis made was a map, a specific, historically situated, technically impressive map that reflected the geographical knowledge available to an exceptional cartographer in 1513. That is what he made. That is what survives. The interpretations that have been placed on his map, the Antarctica hypothesis, the ancient Sea Kings narrative, the lost civilization mythology, are not his. They are the interpretations of later readers who brought their own preoccupations to his work and found in it what they were looking for. This is a universal aspect of the afterlife of significant documents. Once a document enters the public record, it begins to accumulate interpretations that its author could not have anticipated and would not necessarily recognize. The document becomes a vessel for the concerns of later readers, as much as a record of its creator's intentions. The honest response to this is to try to distinguish as carefully as possible between what the document actually says and what later interpreters have read into it. This is the basic method of historical scholarship, returning to the primary source, understanding it in its own context, resisting the temptation to use it as evidence for preoccupations that are ours rather than its creators. The Piri Reis map, read in its own context, is the work of a remarkable navigator and cartographer at a remarkable moment in the history of geographical knowledge. It does not show Antarctica, but it shows something just as interesting. The world as one of the most knowledgeable geographers of 1513 understood it. And that world, on the cusp of being fully mapped for the first time in human history, still containing the speculative southern lands of theoretical imagination, still alive with the excitement of recent discovery, is a world worth knowing about. The map is a document of that world, and of the mind that tried to represent it. Let me tell you about the genuine mysteries that remain in the history of exploration. The things that don't fit neatly into the conventional timeline and that deserve serious investigation. Having spent most of tonight's journey debunking a specific claim about the Piri Reis map, I want to be clear that the debunking is not a defense of the idea that the conventional history of exploration is complete and fully understood. It is not. The history of how human beings came to know the geography of their world is genuinely complex, genuinely full of gaps, and genuinely incomplete. The specific claim that the Piri Reis map shows Antarctica is wrong. That does not mean that everything the conventional account says about ancient and medieval geographical knowledge is right. Let me start with a genuine puzzle that the conventional account handles poorly: the question of who first reached the Americas. The conventional account in most popular histories gives Columbus the credit for the European discovery of the Americas in 1492, with a footnote for the Norse settlement of Vinland around 1000 CE. But the evidence for pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the Americas is more substantial than this simple picture suggests. The Norse connection is well established. L'Anse aux Meadows, the Norse settlement site in Newfoundland, was excavated beginning in the 1960s and has been dated to approximately 1000 CE. The Norse sagas describing the discovery of Vinland, the land to the west, are consistent with a North American landfall. The conventional account accepts Norse contact with the Americas, but Norse contact may not have been the only pre-Columbian connection. Genetic studies published in the last decade have found clear evidence of a pre-Columbian connection between Polynesian populations and indigenous South American populations. The evidence comes from multiple independent lines. specific genetic variants found in both Polynesian and South American populations that are not found elsewhere. The presence of chicken bones in pre-Columbian South American archaeological contexts that are genetically related to Pacific chickens rather than American wild birds, and the distribution of the sweet potato, a South American plant, across the Pacific Islands, including in regions that European explorers had not visited before the plant appeared. The genetic evidence is now compelling enough that most researchers who have examined it accept that pre-Columbian contact between Polynesia and South America occurred, probably around 1200 CE, about 300 years before Columbus. Polynesian navigators whose extraordinary ability to cross vast stretches of open ocean has been increasingly recognized and documented in recent decades, reached the western coast of South America and introduced the sweet potato to their return voyages. This is a genuine addition to the history of pre-Columbian exploration. It is not the kind of dramatic lost civilization story that the alternative history tradition favors. It is the story of remarkable navigators, the Polynesians, who were crossing the Pacific using methods that are still being studied and that are genuinely impressive, making contact with a continent that European navigators would not reach for another 3 centuries. The Polynesian achievement in navigation deserves much more attention than it typically receives in popular histories of exploration. The settlement of the Pacific, the colonization of islands spread across 30 million square kilometers of ocean, was one of the most remarkable feats of navigation in the history of the world. It was accomplished without instruments in the European sense, using methods of celestial navigation, ocean current reading, and wave pattern interpretation that are being reconstructed by modern researchers working with Pacific Islander communities who maintain these traditions. The specific navigational methods that allowed Polynesian people to find tiny islands in a vast ocean, to sail to South America and back, and to settle a larger area of the Earth's surface than any other people in the history of prehistoric exploration. These are genuinely extraordinary capabilities that the conventional history of navigation has underappreciated. The second genuine puzzle I want to discuss is the question of pre-Columbian contact across the Atlantic from Africa. The conventional account holds that there was no significant contact between West Africa and the Americas before Columbus. But there is a body of evidence, not conclusive but suggestive, that pre-Columbian contact between West Africa and the Americas may have occurred. The evidence includes the presence of specific cultural practices and specific crop plants in both West Africa and northeastern South America that have been argued to reflect contact rather than independent development. It includes the analysis of certain pre-Columbian skeletal remains in the Caribbean that have been argued to show African genetic affinities. And it includes the specific oceanographic fact that the Atlantic current system naturally carries westward from West Africa to the Caribbean. That a vessel without propulsion from the mouth of the Senegal River would drift westward and eventually reach the Caribbean. None of this constitutes definitive proof of pre-Columbian African-American contact. The cultural similarities may reflect independent development or be coincidental. The skeletal evidence is disputed. The oceanographic possibility is real, but possibility is not evidence. But the question is genuine and has not been definitively resolved. It deserves more careful investigation than the conventional dismissal it typically receives. The third genuine puzzle is the one we touched on in Part 8, the specific question of what happened to the geographical knowledge accumulated by ancient mariners. The Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the ancient Indians. And how much of it found its way into the medieval and Renaissance cartographic tradition. We know that geographical knowledge was transmitted between cultures in the ancient world. The Arab geographical tradition incorporated knowledge from Persian, Indian and Chinese sources. The medieval European tradition incorporated knowledge from the Arab geographical tradition, which incorporated knowledge from the ancient Greek tradition, which incorporated knowledge from Egyptian and Phoenician sources. The specific chains of transmission are imperfectly documented, and the possibility that some ancient navigational knowledge was preserved and transmitted in ways that have not been traced is real. This is not an argument for the ancient Antarctic survey. It is an argument that the history of how geographical knowledge was accumulated and transmitted is genuinely complex and genuinely incompletely understood, and that careful historical research into that history may reveal things that the conventional account has missed. The conventional account of the history of exploration is not the final word. It is the best current understanding of the available evidence. New evidence will change it. New methods of analysis will refine it. New discoveries of previously unknown archives, previously unstudied documents, previously unexcavated sites will complicate it. The honest stance is to hold the conventional account firmly where it is well supported and tentatively where it is not. To distinguish between the things we know well and the things we know poorly, and to remain genuinely open to revision where the evidence is genuinely uncertain. The Piri Reis map does not show Antarctica. That conclusion is well supported. The pre-Columbian contact between Polynesia and South America occurred. That conclusion is now well supported. The full history of how ancient and medieval peoples came to know the geography of their world is not yet understood. That conclusion is simply honest. The genuine mysteries of the history of exploration deserve serious, rigorous investigation. They are more interesting than the false mysteries of the alternative history tradition, because they are real. Let me develop the Polynesian navigation story more fully, because it is one of the most extraordinary stories of human exploration, and it is genuinely underappreciated. The Polynesian settlement of the Pacific Ocean is one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of human exploration. Between approximately 1500 BCE and 1200 CE, Polynesian people colonized virtually every habitable island across an ocean that covers 1/3 of the Earth's surface. From Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the south, from Easter Island in the east to the Marshall Islands in the west. The distances involved are staggering. Hawaii is more than 3,000 kilometres from the nearest substantial island group. Easter Island is more than 2,000 kilometres from the nearest inhabited land. New Zealand is more than 2,000 kilometres from the nearest significant Polynesian population centre. These voyages were not accidents. Polynesian navigators did not drift to these islands on the ocean currents and happen to find them. They sailed purposefully, navigating by specific methods that allowed them to find specific destinations across open ocean without landmarks or instruments in the European sense. The specific methods of Polynesian navigation have been studied and partially reconstructed by researchers working with island communities, where some elements of the traditional navigational knowledge survive. The methods included the reading of star paths, the rising and setting positions of specific stars that provided directional reference across the night sky. They included the reading of ocean swells, the long, regular wave patterns generated by distant storms that travel consistently across the Pacific and can be felt by a person lying on the deck of a canoe. They included the reading of cloud patterns and the behavior of birds, the specific species and flight patterns that indicated the proximity of land. These were not simple or crude techniques. The stellar navigation required the memorization of the rising and setting positions of hundreds of stars across the full year. The ocean swell reading required years of experience and a specific kind of bodily sensitivity to the motion of the ocean. the cloud and bird reading required deep knowledge of the natural history of specific Pacific species. The knowledge required to navigate across the Pacific was accumulated over generations, encoded in specific forms, stories, chants, charts made of sticks and shells, and transmitted from master navigators to their successors. It was a sophisticated, highly specialized body of knowledge that took a lifetime to master. And it worked. The Polynesian settlement of the Pacific is the proof that it worked. The colonization of Hawaii and Easter Island and New Zealand, islands that are genuinely difficult to find, genuinely remote, required navigational capability of a very high order. The Polynesians had that capability. The pre-Columbian contact between Polynesia and South America is the most recent confirmation of this capability. Polynesian navigators not only found the small islands of the Central Pacific, they found a continent, navigating thousands of kilometers to the east, reaching the coast of South America, returning with the sweet potato, and incorporating this crop into the agricultural systems of the Pacific Islands. This is a remarkable achievement that the conventional history of exploration has not adequately celebrated. The story of exploration is typically told as a story of European achievement. Columbus, da Gama, Magellan. The Polynesian achievement is comparable in scale and arguably surpasses it in navigational sophistication, because Polynesian navigators accomplished their voyages without the navigational instruments and the documentary traditions that European navigators had. The Polynesian story is a genuine addition to the history of human exploration that deserves to be much better known. Now let me also think about what a rigorous approach to the genuine mysteries of exploration history looks like. What distinguishes the legitimate investigation of pre-Columbian contact from the illegitimate alternative history tradition? The legitimate investigation uses specific, testable methods: genetic analysis, archaeological excavation, isotopic analysis of materials, the study of documented oral traditions. It produces findings that can be independently replicated. It acknowledges uncertainty honestly and proportionately. And it is open to revision when new evidence or better analysis produces a different conclusion. The genetic evidence for Polynesian South American contact is a good example of the legitimate approach at work. The hypothesis that pre-Columbian contact occurred was made based on cultural and botanical evidence. It was then tested using genetic methods that were independent of the original hypothesis. The genetic evidence confirmed the contact. Additional independent tests, the analysis of chicken bones, the genetic analysis of sweet potato varieties, provided further confirmation. The conclusion is now well supported by multiple independent lines of evidence. This is how genuine historical mysteries get resolved, not by invoking ancient sea kings or earth crust displacement. By the patient application of specific, testable methods to specific evidence, with honest acknowledgement of what the evidence shows and what it does not show. The alternative history tradition, by contrast, typically works in the opposite direction, starting from a desired conclusion and finding evidence that can be interpreted as supporting it. The specific tests that would distinguish the hypothesis from alternative explanations are not applied. The evidence that conflicts with the hypothesis is ignored or reinterpreted, and the hypothesis is presented with a confidence that the evidence does not warrant. The distinction between these two approaches is not just methodological, it is moral. It reflects a fundamental difference in relationship to evidence. Whether you are genuinely trying to find out what happened, or whether you are trying to find confirmation for something you already believe. The genuine mysteries of exploration history deserve the first approach. They are interesting enough to merit honest inquiry. They do not need to be embellished. Let me close this part with a thought about what the genuine mysteries of exploration history reveal about human nature, about the specific kind of beings we are and the specific kinds of achievements we have always been capable of. The Polynesian settlement of the Pacific is not an anomaly that requires an ancient advanced civilization to explain. It is an achievement of specific human beings, living in specific historical circumstances, using specific techniques that they developed and transmitted and refined across generations. It is an achievement that was possible because Homo sapiens is a species capable of accumulating and transmitting knowledge across generations in ways that allow each generation to build on what the previous ones knew. This is the specifically human capability. Not the ability to navigate without instruments or to cross open ocean or to find tiny islands in a vast sea. These are specific skills that can be developed by any sufficiently motivated human group with sufficient time. The specifically human capability is the ability to transmit these skills across generations, to encode them in cultural forms, stories, chants, stick charts, that outlast any individual navigator's lifetime and allow the knowledge to accumulate. The same capability underlies every other human achievement: the cave paintings, the stone circles, the astronomical alignments, the Portolan charts, the 1513 Piri Reis map. Every human achievement rests on the accumulated knowledge of all the generations that came before, transmitted through cultural forms that preserve and extend it. This is a more genuinely remarkable story than the alternative history tradition's lost civilization narrative. The lost civilization narrative implies that the achievements of ancient peoples required special capabilities that ordinary humans do not have: an advanced technology, a super civilization, a knowledge base beyond the reach of the people we know about. It makes ancient achievement mysterious by disconnecting it from the ordinary processes of human knowledge accumulation. The real story is different. The real story is that the ordinary processes of human knowledge accumulation, patient observation, skilled transmission, incremental improvement across generations, are capable of producing extraordinary achievements. The Polynesian navigation system was not magic. It was the product of generations of navigators who observed the ocean carefully, taught what they knew to their successors, and continuously refined the knowledge through experience. The same is true of the Portolan chart tradition, and the same is true of what Piri Reis was doing in 1513. He was the beneficiary of centuries of accumulated navigational knowledge from the Mediterranean Portolan tradition, from the Arab geographical tradition, from the Portuguese and Spanish exploration charts. And he synthesized that knowledge into a representation that was more comprehensive than any of its individual sources. That is how knowledge works. That is how human achievement works, not through lost civilizations and ancient sea kings, through the patient, cumulative, multi-generational work of real people doing the best they could with what they knew, and leaving records of that work in cave paintings and stone circles and Portolan charts and Ottoman world maps that allow us, 5 centuries or 5 millennia later, to see what they saw and understand what they understood. That is what the Piri Reis map is, a record of what one remarkable person understood in 1513, on gazelle skin, with a pen. Let the night settle around the map. Imagine the room where Piri Reis worked in 1513, wherever it was, whatever it looked like. A room with a table, and on the table a piece of gazelle skin stretched flat, and on the skin the accumulation of everything he knew about the world. The ink is still wet in places. The compass rose has been carefully drawn, and the rum lines radiate from it in straight lines that cross the Atlantic. The Americas are there, roughly in the right place, drawn from charts that are barely a decade old. The Mediterranean is there rendered with the confidence of centuries. And at the bottom of the skin, in the south, the speculative landmass curves east across the vellum, drawn from the tradition of the geographers and the theorists, filling in the space where the known world ends and the unknown world begins. Piri Reis sets down his pen. He looks at what he has made. He does not know that this map will be folded and filed away in a palace archive for 4 centuries. He does not know that it will be rediscovered in 1929 and will become the subject of one of the most persistent controversies in the history of cartography. He does not know that scholars and dreamers and alternative history writers will spend 100 years arguing about what his southern landmass shows. He knows only that he has made the best map he can with the knowledge available to him. That the Mediterranean is right. That the Americas are approximately right. That the South is speculative, but that something is there, has to be there, because the world requires a southern land to balance the lands of the North. He rolls up the vellum. The candlelight catches the edges of the scrolled map, the ridges of the rolled skin catching and releasing the light as the roll tightens. And then the room is dark, and the map is in the dark, and the world it represents, the world of 1513, on the cusp of being fully mapped for the first time in human history, is in the dark. Now let me try to find the right words for what tonight has been about. We have been in the company of a map. Not the map as mythology, not the lost civilization version, not the ancient sea kings version, not the Antarctic survey version. The map as history. As a specific, datable, historically situated document that reflects the specific knowledge and the specific conventions of a specific historical moment. That historical moment was extraordinary. The age of exploration was transforming the European and Ottoman understanding of the world in real time, and the people living through it were grappling with new information that challenged everything their geographical tradition had assumed. Piri Reis was one of those people, one of the most skilled and best informed of them, and his map is a record of how he grappled with that information. The southern landmass is not a mystery. It is a convention. It is the way that a cartographer of 1513 represented the regions he had not explored, with a theoretical southern land that every educated person of his time expected to be there, placed in the south where the exploration had not yet reached, decorated with the conventional features of the Terra Australis that his tradition had inherited from Ptolemy and his successors. This is not a diminishment. Understanding the map correctly is not a smaller or less interesting thing than believing it shows Antarctica. It is a richer and more historically grounded thing, a connection to the specific quality of a specific moment in history, to the specific challenges and achievements of a specific group of human beings who were doing something that had never been done before. They were mapping the whole world, not perfectly, not all at once, not without errors and conventions and speculative extensions, but for the first time they were attempting to represent the entire surface of the Earth in a single document, to make the whole world visible, to hold the globe in a single glance. The Piri Reis map is part of that attempt. It shows us how far the attempt had come in 1513. It shows us where the known ended and the unknown began. And it shows us, in the speculative southward extension of the southern landmass, the specific quality of the human imagination confronting its own limits. Filling in the blank, not with nothing, not with a simple admission of ignorance, but with a representation of what must be there, what should be there, what the logic of the world requires to be there. The Terra Australis was wrong. Antarctica is not where the cartographers expected it to be. It is further south and colder and less inhabited than the theoretical southern continent, that appeared on maps for centuries. But the impulse that put a southern land on the map, the impulse to represent the whole world, to refuse to leave the blank empty, to fill in the unknown with the best available theory, that impulse was right. It is the same impulse that drives all geographical exploration, the same impulse that sent Vasco da Gama around the Cape and Columbus across the Atlantic and Magellan around the world. The impulse to know, to see, to represent what is there, however imperfectly, however tentatively. Let that impulse rest now. Let the map rest in the Topkapi Palace, where it has been since before living memory. In its climate-controlled storage, protected from the light that would fade the already fading ink. The gazelle skin is still there. The ink lines are still there, the rum lines and the compass roses, and the coastlines of Europe and Africa and the Americas and the speculative South are still there, exactly as Piri Reis drew them. They have survived wars and conquests and the fall of empires and the redrawing of the world's borders and the complete transformation of everything that the world looked like in 1513. The map survived. The ink survived. The coastlines survived. And the question at the bottom of the map, what is there in the south where the known ends, is no longer a question. We know what is there. We have been there. We have mapped it thoroughly and drilled through its ice and measured its subglacial topography and installed research stations on its surface. The specific region that Piri Reis marked as unknown is now the most thoroughly mapped desert on Earth. But the boundary between the known and the unknown, the line where the confident pen becomes speculative, where the map stops representing the world and starts representing the imagination, that boundary is still there. It has just moved. It is always moving. Every map is a record of where the boundary was at the moment of its making. And every explorer, whether they are navigating the Southern Ocean, or the outer solar system, or the deep interior of the human mind, is pushing that boundary further out. Let that image rest in the mind now. The boundary moving, the known expanding, the unknown retreating, always retreating, but never quite reached, always just beyond the edge of the best map. Sleep well. But before the night fully closes, let me say one more thing. The specific controversy around the Piri Reis map, the Antarctica hypothesis, the ancient Sea Kings narrative, the decades of popular books and documentaries, is, in the end, a story about what we want the past to be. We want the past to be larger than the present. We want the people who came before us to have been capable of things that astonish us, things that we cannot explain, things that seem to exceed the limits of what we credit them with. We want the world to contain hidden depths that the official account has missed or concealed. These wants are not irrational. They reflect a genuine and legitimate hunger for a world that is more interesting, more mysterious, more full of possibility than the world of the history textbook. They reflect the specific human quality that has always pushed exploration forward, the refusal to accept that what is known is all there is, the conviction that beyond the edge of the current map there is something worth finding. The alternative history tradition channels this hunger toward false mysteries. It gives people the feeling of discovering hidden knowledge, the feeling of knowing something that the experts have missed, without the discipline and the patience that genuine discovery requires. But the genuine mysteries, the Polynesian navigation, the Portolan chart accuracy, the question of pre-Columbian contact, the transmission of ancient geographical knowledge across cultures and centuries, are real. They are there in the historical record, waiting for the kind of patient, rigorous attention that the alternative history tradition cannot provide. The real past is already extraordinary enough. It does not need to be inflated, it needs to be looked at honestly. with the specific quality of attention that hard questions deserve, the kind of attention that you have been bringing to it tonight, in the dark, on the edge of sleep, where the map ends and the unknown begins. Sleep well.